I stood on the porch of my own $1.2 million home leaning heavily on my wooden cane. My key would not turn in the lock. When my daughter-in-law finally opened the door, she looked at me like I was a stray dog tracking mud onto her pristine porch and casually stated that they had changed the locks for security. But the real shock came when I limped into the living room and saw the gaping, empty space on the Persian rug where my late wife's vintage Steinway piano used to sit. My son walked in, looked me right in the eye, and said they sold it to pay for my hip surgery. I did not scream. I did not throw a fit. I just gripped my cane, knowing with absolute certainty that my premium retirement insurance had covered every single cent of my hospital stay. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled their entire lives and took back my dignity, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned and betrayal should never go unpunished. The Georgia afternoon heat was suffocating as the medical transport van pulled away from the curb, leaving me alone at the bottom of my driveway. I am Julius Reed, 75 years old. For the past 3 weeks, I had been stuck in a sterile rehabilitation center recovering from a hip replacement surgery. The only thing that kept me pushing through the grueling physical therapy was the thought of coming back to my sanctuary in Buckhead. I had worked my entire life to buy this house. I scrubbed floors, managed warehouses, and eventually built a solid career in commercial real estate, just so my family would never have to know the struggles I faced growing up. I grabbed my heavy overnight bag, gripping the handle tightly. Every step up the brick walkway sent a dull ache through my new hip, but I ignored it. I just wanted to sit in my favorite leather recliner and listen to the old jazz records my wife Bee used to love. I reached the heavy oak front door, took a deep breath, and slid my brass key into the lock. It stopped halfway. I frowned and tried again, jiggling it slightly. The key refused to turn. It was not just stuck. The entire internal mechanism was completely different. The lock was brand new. I knocked on the door. Nothing. I knocked harder, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet upscale neighborhood. Finally, I heard the click of a deadbolt. The door swung open, and there stood Chloe, my son Kendrick's wife. She was 35, wrapped in a silk designer robe, holding a half-empty glass of sparkling water. She did not smile. She did not welcome me home. Her pale blue eyes scanned me from head to toe, lingering on my cane with a look of pure irritation, as if an inconvenient delivery driver had interrupted her afternoon. "Julius," she sighed, shifting her weight to one hip. "We were not expecting you until dinner. The rehab center called you yesterday," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the sharp pain shooting down my leg. "I told you I was arriving at 2:00. Why does my key not work?" She took a slow sip of her water, looking completely unbothered. "Oh, we changed the locks last week. The neighborhood has gotten so sketchy lately. You know how it is. We have to think about security." Sketchy. We lived in one of the most exclusive gated communities in Atlanta. The only thing sketchy was the woman standing in front of me, blocking the entrance to the house I paid off 20 years ago. I stood there waiting for her to step aside or at least offer to help me with my heavy medical bag. She did neither. She just turned around and walked back down the hallway, leaving the door open for me to fend for myself. I picked up my bag, dragging it over the threshold. The house felt different instantly. The familiar scent of lemon oil and old wood, the scent that always reminded me of Bee, was completely gone. In its place was a strong, sickly sweet perfume that smelled like cheap ambition and expensive mistakes. I limped down the hallway, the rubber tip of my cane thudding against the hardwood floors. As I turned the corner into the main living room, I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a second I forgot how to breathe. The massive living room, bathed in the afternoon sunlight, felt completely hollow. The antique Persian rug that covered the center of the room bore 4 deep circular indentations where heavy wooden legs had rested for over 3 decades. The piano was gone. It was not just any piano. It was a vintage Steinway & Sons grand piano. I bought it for Bee on our 20th wedding anniversary. It cost $65,000 back then, and it was worth every single penny to see the tears of joy in her eyes. Bee was a classically trained pianist. That piano was her voice, her soul, her legacy. Even after she passed away 10 years ago, I kept it in perfect condition. I polished the rich mahogany wood every single Sunday morning. I paid a professional to tune it twice a year, even though no one played it anymore. It was the heart of this house. And now there was nothing but an empty, agonizing space on the rug. My hands began to tremble. The bag slipped from my fingers and hit the floor with a heavy thud. "Dad, what are you doing standing there?" I turned around slowly. My son Kendrick stood in the doorway of the kitchen. He was 40 years old, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, playing the role of the successful tech entrepreneur he always pretended to be. But I could see the nervous twitch in his jaw. I could see the way he refused to look me directly in the eye. "Where is your mother's piano?" I asked. My voice was dangerously quiet. It was not a scream. It was a low rumble of a storm approaching from a distance. Kendrick shoved his hands into his pockets, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He cleared his throat, adopting a tone of patronizing patience. "Dad, you have to understand. Your medical bills were draining us. The surgery, the rehab center, the physical therapy, it was getting completely out of hand." I stared at him, letting his words hang in the silent room. "The piano was just collecting dust anyway." Kendrick continued, his voice gaining a false sense of confidence. "You never even play the thing. We had to make a practical family decision. Chloe found a buyer. We sold it to pay for your surgery and to set up a fund for your home care. We did this for you, Dad. You should be thanking us." Chloe walked into the room, standing behind Kendrick and resting her chin on his shoulder. She looked at me with a sickeningly fake smile. It was a beautiful antique Julius. "But health comes first. You are just too weak to understand the financial burden you put on us." They stood there united in their deception, looking at me as if I were a fragile, senile old man who should be grateful for their sacrifice. They expected me to cry. They expected me to argue. They expected the messy, emotional outburst of a grieving widower. But I am not a foolish man. I did not survive 75 years in this world by letting people play games with my intelligence. I did not scream. I did not throw my cane. I simply lowered myself into the armchair near the window, gripping the curved wooden handles. "I understand," I murmured, staring at the empty space on the rug. "Thank you for taking care of things." Kendrick exhaled a loud breath of relief, completely missing the deadly calm in my eyes. "Of course, Dad. We are family. Why do you not just rest here? I will bring your bag down to the basement later." The basement, not my master bedroom. The basement. But I did not argue. I just nodded and closed my eyes, listening to their footsteps retreat toward the kitchen. As soon as they were out of earshot, I opened my eyes. The silence in the room was absolute, but my mind was working at lightning speed. My premium retirement fund and my specialized Medicare plan had covered my hip replacement completely. I knew this for a fact because I handled all the paperwork with the hospital administrator myself before I even went into the operating room. My insurance covered the surgery, the 3 weeks in rehab, and even the medical transport van that dropped me off. The out-of-pocket cost was exactly $0. Not a single bill had been sent to this house. Not a single phone call had been made to my son asking for money. If my surgery was fully paid for by my insurance, where did the $65,000 from my wife's piano go? I looked at the 4 dents in the Persian rug. They did not sell that piano to save my life. They sold my wife's memory to save themselves. And the fact that they looked me in the eye and used my failing health as a shield to cover their theft was a line that could never be uncrossed. They thought I was too old and too weak to fight back. They thought they could strip my house bare, lock me out of my own life, and feed me lies while I quietly waited to die. They thought they were the predators in this house. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers were no longer trembling. The initial shock had passed, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I opened my private banking app and began to dig into the shadows of my own home. If they wanted to play a game of ruthless survival, they had no idea who they had just invited to the table. I was going to find out exactly where every single dollar went. And then I was going to make sure they paid it back with interest, starting with their absolute destruction. I sat in the armchair for what felt like an eternity. The empty space on the Persian rug where my wife's piano used to sit was like a gaping wound in the center of the room. My hip throbbed with a dull, relentless ache, but I forced my face to remain completely expressionless. In the world of commercial real estate, where I spent 40 years negotiating with sharks and building an empire from the ground up, you learn very early never to show your hand when you have just been dealt a massive blow. You stay quiet, you observe, you let the enemy believe they have the upper hand. Kendrick finally walked back into the living room. He was carrying a cheap plastic laundry basket with a few of my old shirts and a pair of sweatpants carelessly thrown inside. He did not look me in the eye. Liars rarely do. "Come on, Dad," he said, his voice strained with a fake, casual tone. "Let us get you settled in your room. You need to rest." I gripped my wooden cane and slowly pushed myself up from the chair. I expected him to lead me down the main hallway toward the master suite that Bea and I had designed together with the large bay windows overlooking the garden she planted. But Kendrick did not turn toward the hallway. He walked toward the narrow door near the kitchen, the door that led down to the basement. I stopped. My cane rested heavily on the hardwood floor. "What are you doing, Kendrick?" I asked. My voice was calm, completely devoid of the panic he was probably expecting. Chloe stepped out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a linen towel. She looked at me with that same patronizing smile, a smile that hit a heart as cold as ice. "You cannot manage the stairs with that hip, Julius," she said smoothly. "It is a safety hazard. We set up a nice quiet space for you down in the basement. It is much better this way. No stairs to trip over, no risk of you falling and hurting yourself again." I stared at her. The master bedroom was on the main floor. There were exactly 0 stairs between the living room and my bedroom. It was a straight, flat walk down a carpeted hallway. She was lying right to my face, and she did not even care how obvious it was. I glanced past her shoulder down the main corridor. The door to the master suite was wide open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. 2 men in delivery uniforms were rolling heavy industrial metal clothing racks right into my bedroom. Racks packed tightly with silk dresses, velvet coats, and expensive designer labels wrapped in plastic. Behind them I could see Chloe's assistants pushing my solid oak dresser out into the hallway to make more room. "Put the summer collection right over there by the window," Chloe called out to the workers, pointing a manicured finger toward the corner of the room. "Just push that old vanity desk out of the way. If it scratches, we will just throw it out." Bea's vanity, the beautiful cherry wood desk where my wife sat every single night brushing her hair. The place where she kept her mother's jewelry box. Chloe was ordering strangers to shove it aside like garbage. I felt a sudden sharp tightness in my chest. It was not my heart. It was pure, unadulterated rage. Chloe owned a high-end fashion boutique in Midtown Atlanta. For the past year, she had been complaining about rent increases and slow foot traffic. She always blamed the economy, never her own terrible business sense. And now, looking at the racks of inventory invading my home, I pieced the ugly truth together. Her boutique was failing. She was bankrupt. She was moving her unsold inventory into my house, turning the sanctuary I built for my wife into a glorified storage unit. And they needed me out of the way to do it. Dad, Kendrick said, placing a hand on my shoulder. His touch felt heavy and suffocating. "Just come downstairs. I set up the television for you. It will be comfortable." I looked at the hand on my shoulder, the hand of the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The boy I had worked 80-hour weeks to put through college so he would never have to sweep floors or haul bricks like I did. He was standing there allowing his wife to erase his mother's memory and banish his father to the dark. "Lead the way," I said quietly. I let him walk me down the narrow wooden stairs. Each step sent a jolt of pain through my healing hip, but I did not wince. I stepped into the basement. It was damp, poorly lit, and smelled faintly of mildew and old cardboard boxes. The air was cold. There was no bay window. There was no sunlight. Just concrete walls, a cheap folding cot pushed against the corner, and a tiny television resting on a plastic crate. This was my reward for a lifetime of sacrifice. This was how my only son valued my existence. "Get some sleep," Dad, Kendrick said, refusing to look around the miserable room he had prepared for me. "We will bring you down some dinner later." He turned around and walked up the stairs. I heard the heavy wooden door shut at the top of the staircase. Then I heard the unmistakable metallic click of the lock turning from the outside. I was locked in. I stood in the center of the cold concrete floor. I did not yell. I did not bang my fists against the door begging to be let out. I slowly limped over to the cheap cot and sat down. The springs groaned under my weight. I rested my cane against the wall. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully neutralized a weak old man who was too frail and too confused to fight back. They assumed that my physical recovery meant my mind was equally fragile. They had no idea that locking me in this quiet, isolated basement was the greatest mistake they could have possibly made. They had just given me uninterrupted time to think. And a man like me with time to think is a very dangerous thing. I reached into my overnight bag and pulled out my tablet. The screen illuminated the dark, damp room, casting a pale blue glow over my face. I connected to the secure cellular network, ignoring the house wireless internet. I needed to know exactly how deep this betrayal went. First, I navigated to the portal for my premium health insurance. I entered my password and pulled up the claims history for the past 30 days. The screen loaded instantly. Status paid in full. Patient responsibility, $0. I stared at the numbers. The hospital, the surgeon, the rehabilitation center, the physical therapy, the medical transport van. Every single invoice was marked with a bright green 0. My insurance and my retirement benefits had covered everything just as I knew they would. Kendrick had looked me directly in the eyes and told me the medical bills were draining them. He told me they had to sell the $65,000 Steinway piano to cover the cost of my care. It was a complete fabrication. A deliberate, calculated lie designed to steal a massive sum of money right from under my nose. But where did the money go? If Chloe's boutique was failing, she might have used the piano money to pay off her vendors. But $65,000 was a lot of cash to move quickly. I needed a broader picture of my financial health. I opened another application. My credit monitoring service. I had always maintained an impeccable credit score, over 800. I paid every bill on time for 50 years. I never carried a balance. As the application loaded, a bright red warning banner flashed across the top of the screen. Critical alert. Your credit score has dropped by 150 points. My breath caught in my throat. 150 points. That was impossible, unless someone was actively destroying my financial identity. I clicked on the alert. The screen populated with a list of recent activities. 3 new accounts had been opened in my name within the last 3 weeks, right while I was lying in a hospital bed, heavily medicated and recovering from major surgery. 3 platinum credit cards. All of them approved and expedited. I clicked on the balances. The numbers hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The first card was maxed out at $15,000. The second card was maxed out at $20,000. The third card carried a balance of $10,000, $45,000 in brand new high-interest debt. I opened the transaction history for each card. My eyes scanned the lines of digital theft. There were massive charges at luxury fashion suppliers in Europe, thousands of dollars spent at high-end restaurants in downtown Atlanta, payments to expensive private social clubs. And then I saw it. The most damning charge of all. Multiple massive wire transfers to an offshore cryptocurrency exchange platform. The puzzle pieces snapped together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Chloe had stolen my identity to open those credit cards to keep her failing boutique afloat and fund her lavish lifestyle. But the cryptocurrency transfers that had Kendrick written all over it. For months he had been bragging about his new digital investments, talking about how he was going to become a millionaire overnight. He had clearly lost everything. He was drowning in crypto debt. They did not just sell my wife's piano. They were actively burying me in debt. They were draining my legacy, bleeding my good name dry, while locking me in a damp basement to die quietly. I sat there on the squeaky cot, staring at the glowing numbers on the screen. The pain in my hip completely vanished, replaced by an icy, sharp focus. They thought they were dealing with an old man who could barely walk. They forgot that I was a man who spent 40 years navigating the cutthroat world of commercial real estate. I had destroyed corporate executives who tried to cross me. I had dismantled businesses that tried to cheat me. My son and his wife had just declared war on a man who knew exactly how to burn their entire world to the ground without striking a single match. I turned off the tablet screen, plunging the basement back into darkness. I sat in the pitch black, listening to the faint sound of footsteps moving across the hardwood floor above me. I listened to the sound of my wife's sanctuary being desecrated by a woman who thought she was untouchable. I took a deep breath of the cold basement air. Let them enjoy their stolen money tonight. Let them sleep comfortably in my house. Tomorrow the real game would begin, and by the time I was finished with them, they would beg to be locked in a basement just to hide from the consequences of what they had done. I stood in the damp basement air, refusing to let the cold settle into my bones. I woke up at 6, exactly as I had done for the last 40 years. My hips screamed in protest the moment I shifted my weight on that cheap folding cot, but I ignored it. Pain is just a signal, and in my line of work you learn to read the signals and push through them. I stood up, gripping my wooden cane, and began the slow, deliberate stretches my physical therapist had taught me at the rehabilitation center. His name was Marcus. He was a good young man, a professional who knew exactly how to push me to recover my mobility. He was scheduled to arrive at 9 to continue my home therapy. I looked at the small digital clock on my tablet. It was 9:15. Marcus was never late. The heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs finally opened. But it was not Marcus walking down those creaky wooden steps. It was Chloe. She was wearing a sharp-tailored blazer holding a clipboard against her chest. Behind her walked a man I had never seen before. He did not look like a medical professional. He wore a custom-fit navy blue suit, a silk tie, and a watch that easily cost $10,000. The strong scent of expensive cologne filled the small basement, masking the smell of mildew. He had slicked back hair and a smile that looked like it had been practiced in front of a mirror 1,000 times. Julius, Chloe said, her voice dripping with that same fake, patronizing sweetness. I have some news. We had to let Marcus go. He was just not a good fit for your recovery plan. And honestly, his fees were becoming a bit of a burden on Kendrick and me. I gripped my cane tighter. Marcus was completely covered by my premium Medicare plan. He did not cost them a single dime. It was another blatant lie delivered right to my face. But I kept my expression entirely blank. I simply nodded, acting like the tired, confused old man they desperately wanted me to be. I want to introduce you to Dr. Thorne, Chloe continued, gesturing to the man beside her. He is a private physician, a very close friend of mine. He is going to be taking over your care from now on. We want only the best for you, Julius. Dr. Thorne stepped forward. He did not carry a medical bag. He did not have a stethoscope around his neck. He extended a manicured hand toward me. I reached out with a slight, deliberate tremble in my fingers and shook it. His grip was weak, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, and entirely devoid of any genuine medical concern. It is a pleasure to meet you, Julius, Dr. Thorne said smoothly. Chloe has told me so much about you. Why do you not sit down on the cot so we can have a little chat? I sat down slowly, exaggerating the stiffness in my joints. I waited for him to ask about my hip. I waited for him to check my surgical incision, or ask about my pain levels, or test my range of motion. He did none of those things. He did not even look at my leg. Instead, he pulled up a small plastic crate and sat directly in front of me, folding his hands over his knees. Julius, he began, his voice lowering into a tone you might use with a slow child. How are we feeling today? Is your mind feeling a bit foggy lately? I am feeling fine, I replied, keeping my voice soft and slightly raspy. My hip hurts a bit, but I am managing. He smiled a thin, tight smile. Yes, the hip. We will get to that. But I am more concerned about your cognitive state, Julius. Post-operative recovery can be very taxing on the brain, especially for someone of your advanced age. Do you know what year it is? I looked at him, then at Chloe, who was standing by the stairs watching me intensely. I knew exactly what year it was. I knew the exact date, time, and current balance of every single one of my investment portfolios. But I saw the trap they were laying. It is 2026, I said quietly. Dr. Thorne nodded slowly, exchanging a quick glance with Chloe. And do you know who the president is, Julius? Can you tell me what city we are in right now? I answered correctly again. But Dr. Thorne did not write anything down on his clipboard. He just leaned back and let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. Julius, Chloe mentioned that you have been having some troubling episodes recently, he said, his eyes narrowing. She told me you have been wandering around the house at night. She said you seemed confused, disoriented, and even a little aggressive when Kendrick tried to guide you back to bed. The audacity of the lie almost made me break my character, wandering around the house at night. They had locked the basement door from the outside. There was a deadbolt securing me in this damp room. I had not taken a single step beyond the bottom of the staircase since they forced me down here. I could not have wandered the house even if I wanted to. They were creating a completely fabricated medical history, and this slick, suited fraud of a doctor was here to document it as fact. I do not remember wandering, I said, making my voice sound small and uncertain. I lowered my gaze to the floor, playing the part of a man losing his grip on reality. That is exactly what worries us, Julius, Dr. Thorne said, placing a reassuring hand on my knee. Memory loss is a tragic but common side effect of trauma and age. You are experiencing severe post-operative agitation. It is causing you to hallucinate and act out. We need to get this under control before you hurt yourself or someone else in this house. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a small orange prescription bottle. He handed it to Chloe. I am prescribing a heavy regimen of sedatives and antipsychotics, Dr. Thorne explained smoothly. These will help calm your nerves, Julius. They will help you sleep through the night and stop the aggressive outbursts. Chloe will make sure you take them twice a day. I stared at the orange bottle in Chloe's hands. Antipsychotics. Sedatives. They were not just trying to build a fake medical file. They were trying to chemically lobotomize me. If I took those pills, I really would become a confused, drooling mess. I would lose my ability to think clearly, to fight back, to protect my assets. They were trying to drug me into actual dementia so they could take total control of my life and my fortune without any resistance. I looked up at Chloe. She was smiling, holding the bottle like it was a prize she had just won. "We will make sure he takes every single dose, Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice filled with a sickening mock concern. "Thank you so much for coming by. I know how busy your private practice is." "Anything for you, Chloe?" he replied, standing up and smoothing his expensive tie. "We will monitor his decline closely. If the agitation continues, we may need to discuss moving him to a specialized facility where he can get round-the-clock supervision." A specialized facility, an asylum. That was the end game. They were going to drug me, declare me legally incompetent, and lock me away in a state-run nursing home so they could sell my $1.2 million house and pay off the massive debts they had racked up. Dr. Thorne turned back to me. "Now, Julius, I want you to be a good patient. Listen to Chloe and Kendrick. Take your medicine. It is for your own good." I raised my hand. I made sure my fingers trembled violently. I reached out and gently grasped Chloe's wrist, looking at her with wide, fearful eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for taking care of me." Chloe pulled her wrist away, wiping her hand on her blazer as if my touch had soiled her. "Just get some rest, Julius," she muttered. They walked up the stairs together. I listened to their footsteps. I heard the heavy wooden door shut, and then I heard the sharp metallic click of the deadbolt locking me in once again. I waited for 5 full minutes. I listened to the faint sound of Dr. Thorne leaving the house and the front door closing. Then I dropped the act. The trembling in my hands stopped instantly. My posture straightened. I pushed myself up from the cot without a single groan of pain. I walked over to the small utility sink in the corner of the basement. Chloe had left the orange bottle of pills on the edge of the plastic crate next to my bed. I picked it up. The label clearly bore my name and the name of a powerful tranquilizer used for severe psychiatric patients. I unscrewed the cap. I tipped the bottle over the sink and let the heavy white pills tumble down the drain. I turned on the faucet, watching the water wash away their attempt to destroy my mind. I would pretend to take them every single day. I would act a little slower, a little more confused. I would give them the exact performance they were paying for. But I needed more than just a clear head. I needed hard, irrefutable evidence. I needed to capture every lie, every scheme, and every criminal conversation they had in the rooms above me. I sat back down on my cot and pulled my tablet from beneath the thin mattress. I bypassed the home network again, connecting through my secure cellular signal. I did not log into my main bank accounts. Instead, I accessed a hidden offshore account that I had set up years ago for emergency business transactions. It was an account neither Kendrick nor Chloe knew existed, completely untraceable to my daily finances. I navigated to a specialized electronics retailer. I did not buy anything cheap. I bought top-of-the-line military-grade micro-audio recorders, the kind that were practically invisible with batteries that lasted for weeks, and microphones sensitive enough to pick up a whisper from across a large room. I ordered 6 of them and paid extra for expedited overnight shipping to a secure locker at a post office 2 blocks away from the house. I could not walk there yet, but I had contacts in this city, people who owed me favors. Getting the package delivered to the basement window would be easy. I confirmed the purchase and closed the tablet. I looked up at the wooden ceiling of the basement, listening to the faint, muffled footsteps of my daughter-in-law walking across my hardwood floors. She thought she was the architect of my demise. She thought she had outsmarted an old man with a broken hip. She did not realize that she had just handed me the exact blueprint of her criminal conspiracy. They wanted to build a fake medical file. I was going to build a very real federal case against them. And when the time came, I would not just lock them out of my house. I would lock them away for a very long time. I leaned back against the cold concrete wall, folding my hands across my chest. The game had shifted. I was no longer just surviving in this basement. I was hunting, and I was going to enjoy every single second of tearing their world apart. 3 days passed in the cold, damp basement before my delivery arrived exactly as planned. An old friend from my commercial real estate days dropped a small padded envelope through the basement window grate in the dead of night. Inside were 6 military-grade micro-audio recorders. They were smaller than a dime, completely untraceable, and possessed microphones sensitive enough to pick up a whisper from across a large room. I hid them carefully inside the lining of my overnight bag. I was ready. That evening, Chloe unlocked the basement door. She called down the wooden stairs, telling me to come up to the dining room for dinner. This was highly unusual. For the past week, they had simply shoved a plate of cold, bland food down the stairs like I was a prisoner in my own home. An invitation to the main floor meant they wanted something from me. I placed one of the tiny adhesive recorders in the pocket of my wool cardigan. I grabbed my cane and began the slow, agonizing climb up the steps. I made sure to breathe heavily and drag my bad leg. I had to play the part of a fragile man whose mind was slipping away thanks to the heavy sedatives they thought I was swallowing every morning. I walked into the formal dining room. The large oak table was set. Kendrick was sitting at the head of the table, swirling a glass of expensive red wine. Chloe placed a small plate of cheap, overcooked pasta in front of me while she and my son ate thick, premium steaks. I sat down, making sure my hands trembled visibly as I reached for my napkin. I looked at my son. His eyes were restless, constantly shifting around the room. He cleared his throat and reached into his leather briefcase resting on the floor. He pulled out a thick stack of legal papers and placed them right next to my plate. Kendrick leaned forward, putting on a mask of deep concern. He lowered his voice, trying to sound like a protective and loving son. He told me that Dr. Thorne had submitted his preliminary medical evaluation to the state health board. Kendrick said the state was very concerned about my rapid cognitive decline. He looked me right in the eyes and lied without blinking. He said the government was preparing to freeze all of my bank accounts and seize my assets because I was no longer mentally fit to manage my own finances. Kendrick pushed a silver pen across the oak table. He tapped the thick stack of papers. He told me it was a blanket financial power of attorney. He said that if I signed it right now, he could take over my accounts and protect my money from the government. He promised he would manage my retirement fund and make sure my medical care was fully funded. He framed it as a desperate rescue mission. He claimed he was trying to save me from the state bureaucracy. I stared at the legal document. I spent 4 decades reading and drafting commercial real estate contracts. I knew exactly what a blanket power of attorney meant. With my signature on that bottom line, Kendrick would have the ultimate legal authority to drain my checking accounts, liquidate my stock portfolios, and take out massive loans against the equity of my house. He would legally become me. He was asking me to hand him the keys to the empire I built with my own blood and sweat. I knew I could not simply refuse. If I refused with a clear and defiant mind, they would know the sedatives were not working. They would realize I was faking my decline. They would find another way to force my hand, or worse, they would speed up their plan to lock me in an asylum. I had to play the game. I reached for the silver pen. I made my hand shake violently. I let my jaw go slack and stared blankly at the paper. I muttered that my vision was blurry and my head felt heavy. Kendrick urged me on telling me to just sign the bottom line so we could eat in peace. Instead of grabbing the pen, I reached for the large ceramic mug of hot black coffee sitting near my plate. I wrapped my trembling fingers around the handle. As I pulled it toward me, I allowed my wrist to spasm. With a calculated, clumsy swipe, I knocked the heavy mug over. The scalding, dark liquid flooded across the oak table and poured directly over the stack of legal documents. Chloe shrieked at the top of her lungs and jumped back from the table to save her expensive silk dress. Kendrick slammed his fist on the wood, cursing loudly as the hot coffee soaked through the thick paper. The ink bled instantly. The official notary seals were ruined. The document was completely destroyed. I slouched in my chair, apologizing profusely in a weak, frail voice. I told Kendrick I was so sorry, but the new medication made me so clumsy and dizzy. I promised him I would sign a fresh copy tomorrow morning when my hands were steadier. Kendrick was absolutely furious. He snatched the soaking wet papers and stormed toward the kitchen trash can, muttering vicious curses under his breath. Chloe ran to the kitchen sink to grab a handful of dry towels. The dining room was empty for exactly 5 seconds. It was all the time I needed. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out the adhesive micro recorder. I slipped my hand under the heavy oak dining table and pressed the tiny device firmly against the wood right in the center where it would capture every whisper in the room. I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on my cane. Chloe rushed back in, scrubbing the table with a wet towel. She glared at me with absolute disgust. I kept apologizing, looking down at the floor like a beaten dog. I told them I was too tired to eat and needed to rest my eyes. Kendrick did not even look at me. He just waved his hand dismissively, pointing toward the basement door. I limped away, letting the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The lock clicked into place, trapping me in the dark once again. I sat on my cheap folding cot in the damp basement. The air was cold, but my blood was boiling. I opened my secure tablet and launched the encrypted audio application. The micro recorder under the dining table was live. I put my wireless earbuds in and listened to the crystal clear audio from the room above me. I heard the sound of glass clinking. Kendrick was pouring himself another massive glass of wine. Chloe was pacing the floor, her heels clicking sharply against the wood. She was furious. She asked Kendrick what they were going to do now that the old fool had ruined the legal papers. She said they were completely out of time. Chloe lowered her voice, but the microphone picked up every single word. She admitted that her boutique was facing total bankruptcy. She confessed that the $65,000 they got from selling the vintage piano of my wife to a shady underground antique dealer in East Atlanta was already gone. She had spent every single cent paying off aggressive vendors and buying new inventory that nobody wanted to purchase. The piano that represented the soul of my wife had been traded for cheap silk dresses and unpaid store rent. Hearing her admit it out loud felt like a physical blow to my chest, but I kept listening. Then Kendrick spoke. His voice was no longer arrogant or patronizing. It was trembling with genuine raw fear. He told Chloe that her failing boutique was the least of their problems. He took a shaky breath and confessed a secret that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He said he was drowning in debt. He had invested heavily in a scam cryptocurrency scheme and lost everything he had. But he did not use a bank loan. He borrowed $150,000 from violent underground loan sharks. Kendrick sounded like a cornered animal. He told his wife that these men were not going to send a collection agency. They knew where he lived. They had threatened to come to the house and break his legs if he did not pay them back by the end of the month. He said he desperately needed my signature on that power of attorney document tomorrow morning. He planned to liquidate my entire retirement portfolio the second the ink was dry, just to save his own life. I took the earbuds out and sat in the absolute darkness of the basement. The situation had escalated far beyond simple greed and financial elder abuse. My son had brought violent criminals to my doorstep. He was willing to drain my life savings and leave me to rot in a state asylum just to pay off the dangerous men he owed money to. He thought I was a helpless old man waiting for the end. He did not know that I was fully awake, fully aware, and ready to tear his entire world apart before those loan sharks ever got the chance to knock on my front door. I sat in the pitch-black basement listening to the steady hum of the dehumidifier in the corner. The only light came from the glowing screen of my tablet illuminating my face in the cold, damp room. I kept my wireless earbuds pressed deep into my ears. The audio feed from the hidden micro recorder under the dining room table was crystal clear. I expected to hear my son and his wife panicking about their massive debts. I expected to hear them arguing about how to steal more money from my credit cards. But what I heard next completely shattered the last remaining fragment of love I held in my heart for the boy I raised. The conflict was no longer just about financial abuse. It had escalated into sheer, calculated cruelty. Chloe was speaking. Her voice was sharp and devoid of any human empathy. She told Kendrick to stop pacing around the dining room and listen to her. She said that Dr. Thorne was fully prepared to sign the official medical certification tomorrow morning declaring that I was suffering from advanced late-stage Alzheimer's disease. She explained that with those signed medical papers, they would not even need my signature on a power of attorney document. They could simply petition the state to grant them emergency medical guardianship. Then she dropped the final blade of the guillotine. She told Kendrick that they were not going to keep me in the house. She said they would stick the old man in that state-run facility down in South Fulton. I stopped breathing. The South Fulton facility was notorious in our community. It was an underfunded, overcrowded state asylum where families abandoned their elderly relatives when they ran out of money or patience. There were constant news reports about severe neglect, patient abuse, and mysterious deaths in that building. It was a place that smelled of bleach and despair. People who went into that facility did not come out. Chloe laughed a dry, humorless laugh. She told my son that I would not last the winter in that dump. She said the conditions were so poor and my hip was so fragile that a severe infection or a bad fall would take me out within a few months. I waited for my son to defend me. I waited for Kendrick, the boy who used to fall asleep on my chest while I watched football on Sunday afternoons, to stand up and tell his wife she had crossed a line. I waited for him to say that he would never send his own father to a place where he would die in misery and neglect. Kendrick did not defend me. He agreed with her. His voice was steady, completely detached from any moral consequence. He told Chloe that the moment I was legally committed to the South Fulton Asylum, they would have full control over my assets. He laid out the real estate motive with terrifying precision. He said the Buckhead house, the home I bought 30 years ago when black men had to fight tooth and nail just to get a mortgage in this neighborhood, was currently valued at $1.2 million. He said they would put the house on the market immediately. They would sell it to the highest bidder cash only. Kendrick said the money from the sale would easily pay off the $150,000 he owed to the violent crypto loan sharks. He told Chloe there would be plenty left over to fund the rebranding of her failing high-end boutique and maintain their lavish lifestyle without anyone ever questioning where the money came from. They were going to erase my entire existence. They were going to strip me of my wealth, lock me in a state-run nightmare to die alone, and then dance on the ashes of the empire my wife and I built. I took the earbuds out of my ears and let them rest around my neck. The silence in the basement felt heavier now, pressing down on my shoulders like physical weights. A weaker man might have wept. A weaker man might have marched up those wooden stairs and confronted them, screaming about betrayal and broken hearts. But I did not shed a single tear. The father in me had just died on this cheap folding cot. Only the survivor remained. I knew I was in a highly dangerous position. I could outsmart a greedy daughter-in-law and a foolish son, but I could not fight a corrupt medical diagnosis on my own. If Dr. Thorne submitted those forged medical documents to the state health board, a judge would sign an emergency guardianship order before I could even hire a lawyer to defend myself. The legal system moves incredibly fast when a licensed physician claims an elderly person is a danger to themselves. I needed heavy artillery. I needed someone who knew exactly how the state legal system operated from the inside out. I opened the encrypted communication application on my tablet and scrolled through my secure contacts. I stopped at the name Marcus Caldwell. Marcus and I grew up together in the same rough neighborhoods of Atlanta. While I went into commercial real estate, Marcus went into law. He spent 30 years on the bench as a highly respected state judge before retiring a few years ago. He was a man of impeccable integrity, and he possessed a mind sharper than a steel trap. He also happened to be my oldest and most trusted friend. I initiated a secure audio call. It rang twice before Marcus answered. His deep, gravelly voice filled the basement. He asked me why I was calling so late, and if my hip was giving me trouble. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him everything. I told him about the changed locks, the missing Steinway piano, the basement exile, the fake doctor, the stolen credit cards, and the violent loan sharks. Finally, I told him about the recording I had just listened to. I explained their plan to declare me legally incompetent and throw me into the South Fulton Asylum to die so they could sell my house. Marcus was silent for a long time. I could hear his heavy breathing through the speaker. When he finally spoke, his voice was trembling with a cold, restrained fury. He said he had seen hundreds of cases of elder abuse during his time on the bench, but the sheer calculated malice of my own son made his blood run cold. He asked me if I wanted him to send a police cruiser to the house right now to escort me out safely. I told him no. I said I did not just want to escape. I wanted to destroy them. I wanted to make sure they lost absolutely everything they valued. Marcus understood, but he warned me that we were walking a very dangerous line. He explained that audio recordings obtained inside a private residence without two-party consent could be deemed inadmissible in a civil guardianship hearing. He said that if Kendrick and Dr. Thorne moved fast enough, they could still cause a massive legal headache that would freeze my assets for months while we fought it out in court. Marcus told me we needed a larger weapon. He said we needed them to commit an undeniable, highly documented federal crime. He told me to let them dig their graves deeper. He explained that if we could get Kendrick to cross the line into federal wire fraud or federal financial tampering, the FBI and the Department of Justice would take over. The fake medical documents would become entirely irrelevant because Kendrick and Chloe would be facing decades in federal prison. I agreed with his assessment. I told Marcus I would handle the trap, and I asked him to have a team of federal financial investigators ready on standby. He promised me he would make a few calls to his former colleagues in the federal prosecutor office before sunrise. We ended the call. I sat in the dark, staring at the concrete wall. Marcus was right. I needed to stop the asylum plan voluntarily. If they submitted those medical papers tomorrow morning, the state would get involved and I would lose control of the narrative. I needed to activate their greed so intensely that they would completely abandon the idea of locking me away. I needed to give them a reason to keep me in this house. I needed to give them a reason to want me to die a natural death. I opened a document editing application on my tablet. I began to craft the ultimate bait. I used my knowledge of high-level corporate finance to design a letter that looked absolutely authentic. I typed out a formal notification from a prestigious Swiss wealth management firm located in Geneva. I addressed the letter to myself. The contents of the letter were simple but devastatingly effective. I wrote that the offshore irrevocable trust fund established by my late wife B had reached maturity. I listed the current balance of the Phantom Trust Fund at exactly $5.5 million. I added highly specific legal jargon to make it look impenetrable. But the most important part of the letter was the final paragraph. I wrote a strict stipulation stating that the primary beneficiary of the $5.5 million trust was Kendrick Reed. However, the funds were locked in a generational hold. They could only be released to Kendrick upon the verified natural death of the account holder Julius Reed. Furthermore, the letter stated that if the account holder was ever placed into state care or declared legally incompetent, the Swiss government would freeze the trust indefinitely pending a 5-year international probate investigation. I reviewed the document carefully. It was a masterpiece of financial manipulation. If Kendrick and Chloe saw this letter, they would realize that sending me to the South Fulton Asylum would completely destroy their chances of getting $5.5 million. They would realize they had to keep me comfortable. They had to keep me in my own home. And most importantly, they would realize that their massive payday was entirely dependent on me dying without any state intervention. I connected my tablet to the wireless printer I kept in my old home office upstairs. I knew the network password, and I knew the printer was still plugged in on my desk. I hit the print command, sending the fake Swiss banking letter to the machine 2 floors above me. Tomorrow morning, I would pretend to be a confused old man who accidentally left a highly confidential banking letter on the kitchen counter. I would let them find it. I would let them read the $5.5 million figure. I would watch their desperate, panicked minds abandon the asylum plot and shift toward a much darker, much more dangerous path. They wanted to play a game of survival and deception. I was about to hand them the rope they would use to hang themselves. The morning light struggled to pierce the dirty ground-level window of my basement prison. I woke up long before the sun, feeling the familiar ache in my titanium hip, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. Last night, I sent the fake Swiss banking letter to the wireless printer in my upstairs office. Today, I had to retrieve it and plant the bait. I put on my old, worn-out cardigan and gripped my wooden cane. I waited until I heard the heavy footsteps of my son walking across the hardwood floor above me. I knew Kendrick's routine perfectly. He always went into the master bathroom for a long shower at exactly 7 in the morning. Chloe would still be asleep in my stolen bed. This was my only window of opportunity. I limped up the wooden stairs and turned the doorknob. They had left it unlocked, assuming the heavy sedatives they thought I swallowed would keep me unconscious until noon. I pushed the door open and stepped into the silent hallway. The house smelled of Chloe expensive perfume, a scent that made my stomach turn. I moved quickly and quietly, ignoring the burning pain in my leg. I slipped into my old study. The room had been turned upside down with boxes of boutique inventory piled in the corners, but my trusty laser printer was still sitting on the mahogany desk. There, sitting in the output tray, was the document I had drafted. I picked it up and inspected the print. It looked incredibly authentic. The crisp logo of a fabricated Geneva wealth management firm sat perfectly at the top. The legal jargon was dense and intimidating. I folded the heavy parchment paper and tucked it securely inside the pocket of my cardigan. I stepped back out into the hallway and made my way toward the kitchen. The kitchen was a mess. Empty wine bottles and takeout containers cluttered the expensive granite countertops. This was how they treated the home my wife spent years keeping immaculate. I walked over to the kitchen island where Kendrick always threw the Daily Mail and his car keys. There was a stack of glossy fashion magazines belonging to Chloe. I pulled the Swiss letter from my pocket and slid it partially under the top magazine, making sure the bold black letters of the bank logo and my name were just visible enough to catch a greedy eye. It had to look like a piece of highly confidential mail that a confused, medicated old man had accidentally opened and absent-mindedly left behind. I knocked over an empty coffee mug next to it to complete the picture of senile clumsiness. I heard the water shut off in the master bathroom. My time was up. I shuffled back down the hallway, dragging my cane, making my steps loud and clumsy. I opened the basement door and descended into the damp darkness just as I heard the bedroom door open upstairs. I sat on my cheap folding cot and pulled the wireless earbuds from my overnight bag. I pushed them deep into my ears and opened the encrypted audio application on my tablet. The micro recorder I had planted under the dining room table picked up everything in the open concept kitchen. I closed my eyes and waited for the trap to spring. For the first 20 minutes there was nothing but the sound of Kendrick making coffee and slamming cabinet doors. He was stressed. I could hear the heavy, erratic breathing of a man who knew violent criminals were looking for him. Then I heard the sharp clicking of Chloe heels entering the kitchen. She immediately started complaining. She told Kendrick that her boutique suppliers were threatening a lawsuit if she did not wire them $20,000 by the end of the week. Kendrick snapped back, telling her that her boutique was a black hole and that he had men threatening to break his legs over a $150,000 cryptocurrency debt. The tension in the room was suffocating. They were tearing each other apart, desperate for a lifeline. Then the argument abruptly stopped. The kitchen went dead silent. Through my earbuds, I heard the distinct rustle of heavy parchment paper being pulled from under a magazine. I heard Kendrick take a sharp, ragged breath. Chloe asked him what he was holding. He did not answer right away. I heard the paper shake in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He said it was a letter addressed to me from a bank in Switzerland. Chloe scoffed and told him to throw it in the trash with the rest of the junk mail, but Kendrick told her to shut up and listen. He began to read the letter out loud. He read the fabricated opening paragraph detailing the status of an irrevocable offshore trust fund established by Beatrice Reed. I heard Chloe gasp when he read the name of my late wife. Then Kendrick's voice cracked as he read the current balance. $5.5 million. The absolute silence that followed was heavy with shock. $5.5 million. It was a sum of money that could instantly erase every single one of their failures. It could pay off the violent loan sharks, save the failing high-end boutique, and fund their arrogant lifestyle for decades. I listened as Chloe snatched the paper from his hands. I could hear her manicured nails scratching against the heavy paper as her eyes scanned the fake legal document. Kendrick started laughing. It was a frantic, manic laugh of a desperate man who thought he had just won the lottery. He said they were saved. He told Chloe they did not need to sell the house right away. He said they just needed to force me to sign the trust over to them. But Chloe, the true predator in that kitchen, cut him off. She told him to stop celebrating and read the fine print. She read the exact trap I had carefully laid out for them. The primary beneficiary is Kendrick Reed, but the funds are locked in a generational hold. The assets can only be dispersed upon the verified natural death of the account holder, Julius Reed. Kendrick groaned in frustration. He said it did not matter because they were going to get Dr. Thorne to sign the Alzheimer's certification today and lock me in the South Fulton Asylum by the weekend. He figured once they had medical power of attorney, they could bypass the rule. But Chloe's voice turned incredibly cold and sharp. She read the final paragraph of the letter loudly into the quiet kitchen. If the account holder is ever placed into state care or declared legally incompetent, the Swiss government will freeze the trust indefinitely pending a 5-year international probate investigation. The realization hit them like a freight train. Through the tiny hidden microphone, I listened as their entire grand plan collapsed into dust. If they handed those fake medical papers to the State Health Board, they would trigger a massive international legal freeze. They would not see a single dime of that $5.5 million for half a decade. And Kendrick did not have half a decade. He did not even have half a month before the loan sharks came to collect their blood money. Chloe did not waste a single second. I heard the rapid tapping of her phone screen. She put the call on speaker. Dr. Thorne answered, asking if they were ready to submit the medical commitment forms. Chloe told him to destroy the papers immediately. Dr. Thorne was confused. He reminded her that she was the one rushing the process. Chloe raised her voice and told him the plan had changed. She said they could not risk state intervention under any circumstances. She ordered him to tear up the Alzheimer diagnosis and delete any digital record of his visit. She hung up the phone. The asylum plan was officially dead. I had successfully saved myself from being locked in a state-run nightmare using nothing but a printer and their own blinding greed. But the victory was only the beginning of a much darker chapter. I kept the earbuds pressed tightly into my ears, listening to the heavy silence in the kitchen. Kendrick asked Chloe what they were supposed to do now. He was panicking, reminding her that he owed dangerous men a massive sum of money, and if they could not sell the house or access the trust, he was a dead man. Chloe slammed her hands down on the granite countertop. Her voice was completely devoid of any human morality. She told him to stop whining and think about the situation. She said the Swiss bank account held over $5 million, but it would only be released upon my natural death. Chloe lowered her voice to a chilling whisper, but the military-grade microphone caught every single syllable. She said if they locked me up, the state might seize the trust to pay for my medical care and freeze the rest. She told my son that they needed me to stay right here in the house. She said they needed me to die naturally, and they needed it to happen very soon. Kendrick hesitated for a moment. He asked her how a healthy man who just survived major surgery was going to suddenly drop dead naturally. Chloe let out a dark, terrifying chuckle. She said people with recent hip replacements develop blood clots all the time. She said old men have heart attacks in their sleep every single day. She told her husband that nature just needed a little push. I took the earbuds out and placed them carefully on the plastic crate next to my cot. The cold, damp air of the basement felt completely different now. The game of financial elder abuse had officially ended. They were no longer trying to steal my house or drug my mind. My son and his wife had just crossed the line into premeditated murder. They had taken the bait perfectly, but their reaction was more ruthless than even my old friend Judge Caldwell had anticipated. I sat in the dark, staring at the concrete wall. I felt no fear. I felt no sorrow. I only felt an icy, absolute resolve. They wanted me to die in this house so they could become millionaires. They were going to start planning a fatal accident or a sudden medical emergency. They thought they were the hunters stalking a weak, wounded animal in the basement. They had no idea that they were simply dancing on the strings I had tied around their greedy little necks. I reached for my tablet and began to prepare the next phase of their absolute destruction. The heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs opened smoothly. This time there was no harsh metallic click of the deadbolt beforehand. The door had been left unlocked all night. I sat on my cheap folding cot and listened as soft, careful footsteps descended the wooden steps. It was Chloe. She was carrying a silver tray holding a plate of scrambled eggs, fresh toast, and a steaming cup of coffee. The stark contrast between the cold, damp concrete walls and the elegant silver tray was almost comical. Chloe wore a soft knitted sweater and a warm, caring smile that made my stomach churn. She walked over to my cot and spoke in a voice so sweet it sounded like poison disguised as honey. "Good morning, Julius," she said, placing the tray on the plastic crate next to my bed. "Kendrick and I were talking last night, and we realized we have been so stressed with work that we neglected you. We want to make sure you are comfortable. We want to take care of you properly." I stared at the steaming coffee. Just 24 hours ago, they were starving me and planning to lock me in an underfunded state asylum to rot. Now, because they believed I was sitting on a $5.5 million offshore trust fund that only paid out upon my natural death, I was suddenly their treasured patriarch. Kendrick followed her down the stairs holding a folded blanket. He looked at me with eyes full of fake devotion. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with rehearsed emotion, "we are going to make this space nicer for you. We just want you to rest and recover. Take all the time you need." I reached out with a trembling hand and took a piece of dry toast from the tray. "Thank you," I whispered, keeping my voice weak and raspy. "You are good children to look after an old man like me." I took a small bite of the toast, making sure it was plain and dry. I would not touch the coffee or the eggs. They smiled at each other, a look of triumphant greed passing between them, and walked back upstairs. As soon as their footsteps faded, I reached into my overnight bag and pulled out my wireless earbuds. I connected them to my secure tablet and tuned into the micro recorder I had planted in my upstairs study. The audio fed directly into my ears. I listened as Kendrick and Chloe walked into the study and closed the door. The fake sweetness instantly evaporated from their voices, replaced by a cold, calculating darkness. Chloe was sitting at my mahogany desk, typing rapidly on her laptop keyboard. She told Kendrick to close the blinds. She said she had been up all night researching on a secure, encrypted browser, routing her connection through international servers so no one could track her search history. Kendrick paced the room, asking her if she found a solution. He reminded her that the violent cryptocurrency loan sharks were demanding their $150,000 by the end of the week, and they could not wait for an old man to die of natural causes. Chloe stopped typing. Her voice dropped to a chilling, clinical whisper. She told my son that she had accessed a hidden marketplace on the dark web. She found a supplier operating out of Eastern Europe who sold untraceable chemical compounds. She told Kendrick she was purchasing a highly concentrated liquid potassium solution. She explained the science of murder with absolute detachment. She said that a lethal dose of liquid potassium injected or mixed into a strong cup of black coffee would cause immediate massive cardiac arrest. Furthermore, she explained that once the heart stopped, the potassium would rapidly dissipate into the bloodstream, mimicking the exact natural levels found in a human body after death. She told my son that for a 75-year-old man recovering from major hip replacement surgery, the county medical examiner would not even order a full autopsy. They would simply look at my age, look at my recent surgical trauma, and sign the death certificate listing natural heart failure as the cause of death. It was the perfect invisible murder. And the best part, she added, was that a natural death certificate would perfectly satisfy the requirements of the fake Swiss banking letter. The $5.5 million trust fund would be released to Kendrick without any state investigation. I sat in the dim light of the basement feeling an icy chill run down my spine. My own son was standing in the house I paid for, actively agreeing to stop my heart. He asked Chloe how long the shipping would take. She told him she paid $10,000 from her stolen credit cards for expedited secure shipping to a dummy mailbox downtown. The package would arrive in exactly 4 days. Kendrick let out a heavy sigh of relief. 4 days, he muttered. We just have to keep the old man happy for 4 days. Then we are rich. I took the earbuds out and placed them on the cot. This was no longer a case of financial elder abuse or gross negligence. My son and his wife had officially crossed the threshold into conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. The stakes were no longer about my bank accounts or my house. The stakes were my life. But I did not panic. I did not rush upstairs to confront them. I opened my encrypted tablet and carefully downloaded the audio files. I backed them up to 3 separate secure cloud servers. Then I initiated a direct encrypted connection to my old friend, retired Judge Marcus Caldwell. When Marcus answered, I did not say hello. I simply transferred the audio file and told him to listen to it immediately. I sat in the dark basement listening to the heavy silence on the line as Marcus processed the recording of my son plotting my execution. When the audio finished, Marcus spoke. His voice was no longer that of a retired judge giving legal advice to an old friend. His voice was steel. Julius, he said, breathing heavily, this is attempted murder. If they take one single step to receive that package, it becomes a federal crime of the highest order. I am calling a private investigator right now. We are going to monitor that dummy mailbox. The second Chloe picks up that package, the federal authorities will have everything they need to lock them in a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. I thanked Marcus and closed the connection. I looked at the silver tray Chloe had brought down to me. I picked up the cup of coffee, carried it over to the utility sink in the corner of the basement, and poured it down the drain. I would not eat or drink a single thing they prepared for me from this moment forward. I survived the brutal streets of Atlanta when I was young, and I survived the ruthless boardrooms of commercial real estate when I was older. I survived by never trusting an enemy who smiled. I reached into the hidden compartment of my medical bag and pulled out the sealed protein shakes and protein bars I had packed for emergencies. This basement was no longer a prison. It was a bunker, and I was completely prepared for war. I spent the next 2 days in the basement eating my sealed protein bars and acting like a frail, fading old man whenever they came downstairs to check on me. Every time Chloe handed me a glass of water, I pretended to drink it but poured it out the moment she turned her back. They thought they had the perfect timeline. They thought they just had to wait for the package to arrive. But criminals always underestimate the impatience of other criminals. It happened on the 3rd night. The house was completely silent. I was lying on my cot, listening to the steady hum of the dehumidifier, when a violent shattering sound echoed through the ceiling. It was the unmistakable sound of breaking glass and heavy metal crushing structure. I quickly grabbed my tablet and opened the application connected to the exterior security cameras of the house. I tapped the screen and pulled up the live feed of my front driveway. The luxury sports car belonging to Kendrick was parked under the street lamp. 3 men dressed in dark clothing were standing around it holding heavy steel baseball bats. They had completely smashed the windshield, the headlights, and the side windows. One of the men leaned into the broken driver's side window and tossed a heavy brick onto the leather seat. Wrapped around the brick was a piece of white paper. They did not run away. They casually walked down the driveway, got into a black unmarked sport utility vehicle, and drove off into the night. They wanted Kendrick to know exactly who did it. They wanted him to know they knew where he lived and where he slept. The hidden micro recorder in the master bedroom picked up the absolute panic upstairs. I put my earbuds in and listened as Kendrick and Chloe scrambled to the window. Chloe screamed when she saw the destroyed car. Kendrick rushed downstairs, his footsteps pounding like thunder against the hardwood floor. He ran out the front door, and I heard him retrieve the brick. When he walked back inside, his breathing was erratic and shallow. He told Chloe what the note said. The cryptocurrency loan sharks were done waiting. The note said he had 24 hours to deliver the $150,000 Or the next time they came to the house, they would not be smashing windows. They would be breaking knees and burning the house to the ground with everyone inside it. Chloe started crying hysterically. She told Kendrick the poison was not arriving until tomorrow afternoon, and even if they used it immediately, it would take weeks to process the fake trust fund and get the cash. The timeline was completely destroyed. Kendrick paced the kitchen floor, muttering to himself. The panic in his voice was raw and unfiltered. He said they could not wait for the dark web delivery. He said they could not wait for me to die naturally. He told his wife that he needed a massive amount of cash by tomorrow morning, or he was a dead man. I sat in the darkness of the basement, watching the live feed of my destroyed driveway and listening to the unraveling of my son. He told Chloe he had no other choice. He said he was going to take the title of my house and force a desperate financial move. He was going to commit federal wire fraud. He was going to mortgage the empire I built to save his own miserable life. I smiled in the dark. The final trap was set, and my son was about to walk right into it, blind and desperate. The morning after the loan shark smashed my son's car, the heavy footsteps above my head were frantic. I sat on the edge of my folding cot in the cold basement with my wireless earbuds pressed deep into my ears. Through the hidden micro-recorder, I listened to Kendrick tearing apart the upstairs home office. I heard the metal drawers of my old filing cabinet crashing onto the hardwood floor. He was looking for the original deed to the house, the very house I worked 3 jobs to pay off completely 20 years ago. The house where I raised him. He found it. I heard the sharp intake of his breath, followed by a desperate, ragged laugh. Kendrick told his wife they had no other choice. A traditional bank loan would take weeks to underwrite and process. He said the men who smashed his car gave him 24 hours before they came back to break his legs and burn the property down. He told Chloe he found a corrupt online lending agency based out of another state. They specialized in rapid, high-interest home equity lines of credit, and they did not require an in-person appraisal or a physical meeting. All they needed was a scanned copy of the deed, a signature, and a notary stamp. I listened with icy precision as my son sat at my mahogany desk practicing my signature. I heard the scratching of his pen against scrap paper as he tried to mimic the exact slant of my handwriting. He cursed under his breath, trying again and again until he felt he had it right. Chloe was standing right beside him. She was not the voice of reason. She was the willing accomplice. She told him she had purchased a fake notary stamp online months ago for her failing boutique business to falsify some vendor documents. I heard the heavy thud of that stamp hitting the fraudulent loan application. They were stealing my legacy. They were using the sanctuary I built for my late wife, B, as a poker chip to pay off violent criminals. They scanned the forged documents and uploaded them to the predatory lending agency. Kendrick requested an immediate cash withdrawal of $200,000 against the equity of my home. He clicked submit. I took the earbuds out and placed them on the plastic crate next to me. I did not yell. I did not bang my fists against the basement ceiling. I just sat in the dim light waiting for the digital machinery of the financial world to do its job. 4 hours later, the screen of my secure tablet lit up in the dark. It was a high-priority critical alert from my property monitoring service, followed immediately by a notification from the executive fraud division of my primary bank. A massive lien had just been successfully placed against my Buckhead property. The online agency had approved the fraudulent application and initiated a wire transfer of $200,000 directly into a joint checking account held by Kendrick and Chloe. My chest tightened. The sheer audacity of their crime was staggering. They had actually done it. They crossed the point of no return. I picked up my secure phone and dialed a direct unlisted number. I did not call the local police. Local police would simply come to the house, ask a few questions, and turn this into a messy domestic dispute that could take months to resolve in civil court. I called the regional vice president of fraud investigations at my bank. I had known him for 15 years through my commercial real estate dealings. He answered on the second ring. He told me his automated systems had already flagged the massive lien and the incoming wire transfer. He said he was preparing to freeze the transaction and lock Kendrick out of the banking system immediately to prevent the theft of my equity. I told him to stop. I instructed him in a calm, measured voice not to block the wire transfer. I told him to authorize the transaction and let the money hit my son account. The banker was completely confused. He warned me that letting the funds clear was highly dangerous. I explained my strategy with absolute cold logic. If we blocked the transfer right now, Kendrick and Chloe would only be guilty of attempted local fraud. They could hire a clever defense attorney and claim it was a misunderstanding or a desperate mistake made under duress. They might negotiate a plea deal and walk away with probation. I was not going to allow them to walk away. I told the banker that if we let the money cross state lines from the online lender directly into Kendrick's personal account, the nature of the crime fundamentally changes. The moment that $200,000 registers as an available balance on his ledger, the trap snaps shut permanently. It instantly becomes a completed act of federal wire fraud and federal financial tampering. Those are charges handled by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Those are crimes that carry a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The banker was silent for a long moment, processing the ruthless perfection of my plan. He finally agreed. He told me he would place a silent monitor on the account. The money would clear, but any attempt to withdraw or transfer those funds to the loan sharks would trigger an immediate federal hold. The money was a mirage. It was just sitting there waiting to serve as the primary evidence in their criminal prosecution. I thanked him and ended the call. I put my earbuds back in. Upstairs, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The notification of the approved $200,000 deposit had just hit Kendrick's phone. The crushing panic of the morning was entirely gone. The fear of the violent loan sharks was instantly washed away by a sudden explosive wave of delusional greed. I listened as Chloe gasped, looking at the digital balance. They felt rich. They felt untouchable. They had successfully stolen $200,000 from an old man locked in a basement, and they genuinely believed they had gotten away with it. But criminals who escape one disaster immediately create another. Chloe told Kendrick that since the money was securely in their account, they did not need to pay the loan sharks the full amount today. She said they could pay them half to buy some time and use the other $100,000 to save her failing high-end boutique. Kendrick hesitated for a second, but his wife's manipulation was relentless. She convinced him that this was their only chance to rebuild their public image and return to the top of the Atlanta social scene. Then she proposed an idea so arrogant, so utterly disconnected from reality that I actually smiled in the dark basement. Chloe announced she was going to host a massive rebranding gala for her boutique, and she was not going to rent a venue. She was going to host it right here inside my $1.2 million Buckhead home. She told Kendrick she would hire the best caterers in the city, valet parking, and a string quartet. She wanted to invite all her wealthy white elite partners, local fashion influencers, and potential investors to show off her supposed massive success. She wanted to parade around my living room drinking expensive champagne bought with my stolen equity, standing on the very spot where she sold my wife piano. Kendrick asked what they were going to do about me. He was worried I might wander upstairs and ruin the illusion. Chloe laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that echoed through the hidden microphone. She told him not to worry about the old man. She said they would just double my dose of sedatives on the night of the party and lock the basement door from the outside. She said I would sleep through the entire event and nobody upstairs would even know the true owner of the house was rotting in the dark beneath their feet. I took the earbuds out and set them down. I looked around the damp concrete walls of my temporary prison. Chloe wanted to throw a gala. She wanted to fill my home with the most influential people in the city to witness her ultimate triumph. She wanted an audience. I decided I was going to give her exactly what she wanted. I was going to let her plan the most extravagant party this neighborhood had ever seen. I was going to let her dress up in her expensive stolen clothes and clink glasses with her arrogant friends. And when she was standing at the absolute peak of her false empire, feeling completely invincible, I was going to walk up those stairs and tear her entire life apart in front of every single person she desperately wanted to impress. The stage was set for their public execution, and I had the best seat in the house. I sat in the darkness of the basement listening to the invasion of my home. It started exactly at 8 in the morning. The heavy rumble of catering trucks vibrated through the thick concrete walls. Footsteps began marching across the original hardwood floors I had installed 2 decades ago. I placed my wireless earbuds on the plastic crate because I did not need the hidden microphones today. The sheer volume of Chloe and her arrogance echoed right through the floorboards above my head. She was barking orders at catering staff, floral designers, and valet attendants. She was transforming the sacred sanctuary I built for my late wife into a cheap, flashy showroom for her failing high-end boutique. I heard the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the heavy thud of ice coolers being dragged across the kitchen tiles. The smell of roasted meats and expensive appetizers wafted down through the air vents, mocking the sealed protein bars I had been surviving on for days. Then came the sound I had been waiting for. The sharp, distinct click of the heavy deadbolt locking the basement door from the outside. I heard a caterer ask Chloe what was down those dark stairs. Her voice dripped with fake tragedy as she answered him. She told the young man to never go near that door under any circumstances. She said her father-in-law was down there suffering from severe late-stage dementia. She warned the catering staff that I was prone to violent, unpredictable outbursts and that I was heavily medicated for my own safety. She painted me as a dangerous monster locked in a dungeon so she could play the glittering, flawless hostess up in the light. I did not pace the damp floor in a panic. I did not shed a single tear of self-pity over the incredible cruelty of her lies. I stood up from my cheap folding cot, my titanium hip functioning perfectly smoothly without a single trace of pain. I walked over to the small garment bag I had hidden behind the water heater on the very first day of my forced exile. Inside that bag was not the loose, comfortable attire of a defeated old man. It was my armor. I unzipped the protective plastic and pulled out a vintage, perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit. I bought this suit in the late 1990s when I became the first black commercial real estate executive at a top-tier Atlanta firm. I wore this exact suit when I walked into boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals with men who initially refused to shake my hand. It was cut from heavy English wool, sharp, unapologetic, and commanding. I put on the crisp white dress shirt, buttoning it with steady, precise fingers. I slipped into the charcoal trousers and fastened my leather belt. I slid my arms into the suit jacket, feeling the familiar heavy weight of absolute authority settle onto my shoulders. I walked over to the small, cracked mirror hanging above the utility sink in the corner of the basement. The man staring back at me was not the frail, helpless victim Chloe described to her caterers. He was a king preparing to reclaim his castle from thieves. I picked up my solid ebony walking cane. B had given it to me on my 60th birthday. It had a heavy polished brass handle shaped like a lion head. I took a soft microfiber cloth from my bag and polished the brass until it gleamed brilliantly in the dim basement light. Every single stroke of the cloth was a silent promise to my late wife. I would not let them desecrate her memory tonight. I would not let them sell her legacy to save their own pathetic lives. Upstairs, the party officially began. The deep, thumping bass of a smooth jazz playlist vibrated through the ceiling, raining down into the basement. Chloe had hired a live string quartet for the entryway, but she also linked her smartphone to the central smart hub of the house to pipe ambient music into every single room. She truly thought she controlled the entire environment. She forgot that I was the one who paid top dollar to have that smart home system custom wired 5 years ago. I sat on the edge of the squeaky cot and opened my encrypted iPad. I brought up the master control application for the house network. Chloe had changed the basic guest password, but she was too foolish to realize the master administrator routing system operated on a completely different secure frequency. I bypassed her superficial firewall in less than 3 minutes. I gained total access to the integrated speakers, the lighting grid, and the high-definition security cameras. I tapped the screen and watched the live video feed from my own living room. The large space where Bea and her beautiful piano used to sit was now packed with wealthy white investors, local fashion influencers, and arrogant socialites drinking expensive champagne. That champagne was paid for by the fraudulent $200,000 federal loan my son took out using my forged signature. I watched Kendrick mingling in the crowd, looking incredibly nervous but trying desperately to project the image of a highly successful tech genius. He kept looking toward the front door, terrified that his violent crypto loan sharks might show up to collect their money. I opened my audio files and linked the hidden micro-recorders directly to the Smart Hub audio output. I queued up the exact recordings I needed for the execution. The audio of Chloe laughing about selling the piano to an antique dealer, the audio of Kendrick admitting he forged my signature on federal bank documents, and the most damning file of all, the audio of Chloe detailing her purchase of black market potassium to induce a fatal heart attack in my sleep. I tested the digital connections silently. Everything was perfectly aligned. When the time came, I would not just cut off her background music. I would broadcast their criminal confessions through every single high-definition speaker in the building at maximum volume. The party reached its peak. Through the ceiling, I heard the sharp, high-pitched tapping of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne glass. The jazz music faded slightly as the guests quieted down. Chloe was preparing to give her grand welcoming speech. I opened the live camera feed and watched her stand confidently on the exact spot where she had humiliated me weeks ago. She smiled brightly at her wealthy guests, thanking them for coming out to support the grand rebranding of her boutique. Then she actually had the audacity to talk about family values. She spoke eloquently about the importance of legacy and building a generational empire. She even wiped a completely fake dramatic tear from her eye as she mentioned her poor, sick father-in-law resting quietly downstairs. She told the crowd how much she loved caring for me and how my supposed illness had taught her the true meaning of compassion and sacrifice. That was my cue. The hypocrisy was so thick it was suffocating. I closed the iPad and tucked it securely into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. I gripped my ebony cane. I walked up the wooden stairs, my leather shoes making absolutely no sound against the wood. I reached the heavy door at the top of the stairwell. Chloe genuinely thought the deadbolt kept me trapped in the dark. She did not know that 3 days ago, while they were out spending my stolen equity, I had unscrewed the internal locking mechanism, modifying the strike plate so it could be effortlessly pushed open from the inside regardless of the lock position. I stood at the top of the stairs listening to my daughter-in-law lie to the elite of Atlanta about her supposed grace and boundless compassion. I heard the guests clapping, gently moved by her fabricated tragic story of elder care. I rested my hand on the cold brass doorknob. The silent guillotine was fully raised and ready to fall. I took one final deep breath, turning the knob and pushing the heavy door wide open. I stood in the darkness at the top of the basement stairs. Through the heavy wood I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses and the pretentious laughter of Atlanta elite. Chloe was right in the middle of her speech. Her voice was amplified by the expensive sound system I had paid for. She was talking about her boutique, her vision, and her deep commitment to family. She actually used the word sacrifice. She told the crowd of investors and socialites how hard it had been to care for her ailing father-in-law. She painted a tragic picture of a man who had lost his mind, a man who did not even know his own name anymore. She said she kept me close because abandoning family was simply not in her nature. I placed my hand flat against the heavy oak door. I did not feel 75 years old. I did not feel the trauma of the hip surgery that had supposedly rendered me an invalid. I felt the exact same surge of cold, absolute power that I used to feel right before I walked into a hostile boardroom to dismantle a rival commercial real estate firm. I adjusted the cuffs of my vintage charcoal gray suit. The heavy English wool fit me perfectly. I gripped the polished brass lion head of my ebony walking cane. I was not going to limp. I was not going to shuffle. I was going to walk into my own living room with the imposing authoritative presence of a king reclaiming his castle from a pack of arrogant thieves. I pushed the heavy door. I did not open it slowly. I shoved it with a sudden violent force. The heavy wood swung open and slammed hard against the corridor wall. The loud physical thud echoed over the soft jazz music and the polite chatter of the party. I stepped out of the shadows and into the brilliant light of the hallway. I walked straight toward the grand living room. Every step I took was deliberate and heavy. The rubber tip of my ebony cane struck the hardwood floor with a rhythmic, commanding thud. I kept my spine completely straight. My shoulders were pulled back. My gaze was fixed forward like a predator locking onto its prey. As I entered the massive living room, the entire atmosphere shifted in an instant. The people standing near the hallway turned around, annoyed at the interruption. But the moment they saw me, their annoyed expressions dissolved into absolute confusion. They parted like the Red Sea, making a wide, clear path for me to walk through. Chloe was standing in the center of the room, right over the exact spot where she had sold my wife piano. She was wearing a stunning emerald green evening gown paid for by the federal bank loan she and my son had fraudulently secured in my name. She was holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne, smiling brightly at a group of wealthy white investors. Then she saw me. The fake, compassionate smile completely vanished from her face. Her pale blue eyes widened in sheer terror. Her fingers went entirely limp. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her hand and shattered into dozens of jagged pieces against my hardwood floor. The sharp sound of the breaking glass cut through the room, silencing the remaining conversations. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still, leaning slightly on my brass-handled cane. I looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with the wealthy guests. They had been told I was a drooling, violent dementia patient locked in the basement for my own safety. But the man standing before them was impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit radiating absolute authority and sharp intellectual clarity. I did not look confused. I looked like the true owner of the $1.2 million estate they were currently standing inside. I shifted my gaze to Kendrick. My son was standing near the expensive catered buffet table holding a plate of roasted appetizers. When he saw me standing there dressed in my old corporate armor, his face drained of all color. He looked like a ghost. The arrogant tech entrepreneur facade completely shattered. He took a terrified step backward, his hand shaking so badly he had to drop the plate onto the table to hide it. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew I was not heavily medicated. He knew I was not suffering from cognitive decline. He knew that the trap they thought they had set for me was actually a cage I had built for them. Chloe was the first to recover her senses. She was a master manipulator, and her survival instinct kicked into overdrive. She realized she had to control the narrative immediately before the investors and socialites started asking questions. She forced a bright, patronizing smile onto her face and rushed across the room, stepping carefully over the shattered glass. She approached me with her arms outstretched, putting on a spectacular performance of a caring, exhausted daughter-in-law dealing with a tragic medical crisis. "Oh, Julius," she said, her voice pitched loud enough for the entire silent room to hear. "You are so confused tonight. You wandered out of your safe room again. You forgot that you are supposed to be resting. Let us get you back downstairs to bed before you hurt yourself." She reached out and firmly grabbed my left arm. Her manicured fingers dug into the sleeve of my expensive wool suit. She tried to pull me toward the hallway, attempting to physically force me back into the shadows before I could speak a single word. Her grip was tight and desperate. The fake smile was plastered on her face, but her eyes were screaming with absolute panic. She was trying to drag me away like a disobedient child in front of 40 strangers. She severely underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. I did not pull my arm away. I did not struggle against her grip. I simply raised my right hand, gripping the polished brass lion head of my walking cane. I lifted the heavy ebony wood several inches off the ground and brought it down against the solid hardwood floor with tremendous violent force. The impact sounded like a gunshot echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the living room. Several guests physically jumped backward in shock. The loud, aggressive sound completely shattered the polite, sophisticated atmosphere of the gala. Chloe froze in her tracks. Her grip on my arm loosened out of pure instinctual fear. I turned my head slowly and looked directly into her panicked, pale blue eyes. My expression was colder than ice. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout. I spoke in a low, deep, incredibly steady tone that carried perfectly through the dead silent room. "Take your hands off me, Chloe," I said. She blinked, staring at me in total disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin another lie to tell the crowd I was hallucinating, but I cut her off immediately. "Take your hands off me right now," I repeated, my voice dropping another octave. "Or I will have you arrested for assault right here in front of every single one of your investors." She let go of my arm instantly, taking a quick, frightened step backward. She looked at Kendrick desperately, silently begging him to intervene and handle the situation. But my son was paralyzed by fear. He was staring at my suit, staring at my cane, staring at the absolute clarity in my eyes. He realized the terrifying truth. I had heard everything. I knew about the fake doctors. I knew about the forged signatures. I knew about the federal bank fraud. The wealthy guests in the room began to murmur among themselves. They were looking at Chloe with deep suspicion. The narrative she had built all evening was unraveling in real time. The brilliant businesswoman who sacrificed so much to care for her ailing father-in-law was suddenly looking like a frightened little girl caught in a massive lie. I stepped forward, moving past Chloe as if she were nothing but an irrelevant obstacle. I walked to the center of my living room, standing exactly where my wife's piano used to be. I looked at the crowd of strangers drinking my champagne and eating food paid for by my stolen equity. The time for hiding in the basement was over. The time for recording their crimes in secret was finished. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My fingers wrapped around the smooth glass of my encrypted tablet. The digital execution was fully prepared, and I was about to play the opening notes of their absolute destruction. I stood in the exact center of my living room, feeling the polished hardwood floor beneath my leather shoes. Kendrick finally broke through his paralysis. He stepped away from the catered buffet table and hurried toward me. His face was glistening with cold sweat under the expensive chandelier lighting. He closed the distance between us, trying to block me from the view of the wealthy investors and socialites who were watching our every move. He leaned in close, his breath reeking of expensive scotch and sheer panic. He whispered frantically, telling me that I was embarrassing the family. He told me to go back downstairs before I ruined the biggest night of Chloe's career. He said if I did not turn around and walk away right now, he would call the police himself and have me forcibly removed to a psychiatric ward. He actually thought he still had power over me. He thought a whispered threat could make me cower and retreat into the dark basement. I did not even blink. I looked at the boy I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed my youth to protect, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just a cold, clinical emptiness. I slowly reached my hand into the inside pocket of my tailored charcoal suit. Kendrick thought I was reaching for a handkerchief or maybe a pill bottle. His eyes darted nervously to my hands. Instead, I pulled out my encrypted tablet. The sleek digital screen glowed brightly against the dark wool of my jacket. I did not say a single word to my son. I simply looked down at the screen and tapped the master override command I had programmed earlier that afternoon. Instantly, the smooth jazz music that had been floating through the $5,000 surround sound speakers abruptly cut out. The sudden deafening silence sucked all the air out of the massive living room. The guests stopped talking. The waiters stopped pouring champagne. Every single eye in the room was fixed entirely on me. I tapped the screen one more time, initiating the sequence that would burn their false empire to the ground. A sharp static crackle echoed from the hidden speakers mounted perfectly in the vaulted ceiling. Then a voice boomed through the room with crystal-clear, high-definition quality. It was Chloe. Her voice was unmistakable, but she was not using her sweet, patronizing hostess voice. She was using the cruel, calculating tone I had listened to in the dark basement. The recording played her exact words detailing how she sold my late wife vintage Steinway piano to a shady underground dealer in East Atlanta. The entire room heard her laugh as she admitted she only got $65,000 for a masterpiece instrument. They heard her confess that she immediately wired every single cent of that money to pay off the aggressive vendors threatening to sue her failing boutique. She called the beautiful piano a dusty piece of junk that was finally doing something useful. I watched the faces of the wealthy investors standing around the room. These were people who prided themselves on culture and refinement. They recognized the absolute vulgarity of what they were hearing. Several women in expensive evening gowns covered their mouths in shock. A prominent real estate developer who had been chatting with Kendrick just moments ago set his champagne glass down on a side table with a look of pure disgust. Chloe stood frozen in the center of the room. Her face turned ashen. She looked like a ghost trapped in the emerald green dress she bought with my stolen equity. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed by the exposure of her own greed. Before the crowd could even process the theft of the piano, the next audio file automatically triggered. This time it was Kendrick. His voice echoed through the massive living room, shaking with desperate ambition. The guests listened in absolute horror as my son negotiated a bribe with Dr. Thorne. They heard Kendrick explicitly lay out the plan to fabricate a late-stage Alzheimer diagnosis. They heard him agree to pay the fake doctor to sign fraudulent medical papers so they could declare me legally incompetent without my knowledge. Then came the most damning part of the conversation. The speakers blasted Kendrick admitting his plan to have his own father committed to the underfunded state-run asylum in South Fulton. The crowd heard him coldly state that I would not last the winter in that miserable facility. They heard him calculate how quickly they could sell this very house to pay off his massive cryptocurrency debts once I was locked away to rot. The reaction in the living room was instantaneous. This was no longer just a scandalous family dispute over stolen property. This was a severe documented criminal conspiracy. Kendrick snapped out of his shock. Pure survival instinct took over his mind. He let out a desperate animalistic yell and lunged toward the entertainment console in the corner of the room. He frantically tore open the cabinet doors, trying to find the source of the audio. He started ripping out wires, pulling expensive cables from the receivers, and smashing buttons on the amplifier. But it was completely useless. I had locked the entire smart home system through my administrative bypass. The audio was streaming wirelessly from my encrypted tablet directly to the integrated ceiling speakers. There was absolutely nothing he could do to stop the broadcast. The wealthy elite of Atlanta do not tolerate being associated with blatant criminality. I watched as 3 major investors turned their backs on Chloe and walked directly toward the front door. They did not say goodbye. They did not ask for their coats. They simply wanted to escape the house before their reputations were stained by this undeniable toxicity. Chloe tried to chase after them, pleading with them to wait, claiming that the audio was somehow manufactured by artificial intelligence. She was grasping at straws, humiliating herself further with every word she spoke. But the investors ignored her completely, stepping out into the warm Georgia night. I looked at my tablet. The final audio file was queued up and ready to play. The room was already descending into chaos, but the true nightmare had not yet begun. I tapped the screen for the third and final time. The speakers crackled again and Chloe's voice returned, but this time she was not talking about selling a piano or hiding my assets. The guests who were walking toward the door suddenly stopped dead in their tracks as the sheer darkness of her words filled the living room. The high-definition audio broadcasted Chloe meticulously explaining her dark web purchase. She detailed the exact price she paid for expedited shipping of a highly concentrated liquid potassium solution. She calmly described the science of murder to her husband. The entire room listened as she explained how the untraceable chemical would induce a massive fatal heart attack in a 75-year-old man recovering from hip surgery. She boasted about how the county medical examiner would simply write it off as natural heart failure. She told Kendrick that nature just needed a little push so they could claim the $5.5 million offshore trust fund she thought I had. The revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. The murmurs of disgust instantly turned into shouts of genuine terror. This was no longer elder abuse or financial fraud. They were standing inside the home of two people actively plotting a premeditated murder. A woman near the hallway let out a piercing scream. Several guests pulled out their cell phones, immediately dialing the police. The elegant rebranding gala had completely collapsed into a scene of absolute pandemonium. People were rushing toward the exit, pushing past each other to get away from Chloe and Kendrick. Kendrick collapsed onto his knees by the ruined entertainment console, holding his head in his hands. He was hyperventilating, his entire body shaking, as he realized his life was completely over. Chloe stood alone in the center of the devastated living room, surrounded by the shattered glass of her champagne flute. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. She finally understood that the frail, weak old man she thought she was manipulating had orchestrated her total public destruction with flawless, ruthless precision. The living room was descending into absolute chaos. The remaining wealthy guests were frozen in their expensive shoes, unable to look away from the catastrophic collapse of the couple they had come to celebrate. Kendrick was scrambling on his hands and knees by the ruined audio receiver. He pulled himself up, his tailored shirt completely soaked with nervous sweat. He looked around the room with wild, terrified eyes, and he started to scream. He pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that it was all a fake. He desperately tried to convince the silent room that his father was a crazy, senile old man who was suffering from a severe psychotic break. He claimed I had used advanced artificial intelligence programs on my tablet to fabricate those horrific audio recordings just to ruin his reputation. He begged the investors to believe that he loved me, and that I was simply a delusional patient who needed to be locked in a psychiatric ward immediately for my own safety. I did not raise my voice to argue with a cornered rat. I simply walked across the hardwood floor, my ebony cane striking the ground with a rhythmic, terrifying precision. I walked past the shattered crystal champagne flute and stopped right in front of the massive catering table covered in expensive caviar and imported cheeses. Kendrick backed away, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically, looking for an exit that did not exist. I reached into the inside breast pocket of my charcoal wool suit. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and slammed it down onto the catering table right next to a silver platter. The heavy thud made Chloe flinch as if she had been physically struck. I looked at my son and his wife with a cold, absolute emptiness. I told them they had made a fatal miscalculation. I said they looked at me and only saw a retired postal worker, a tired old man with a bad hip who spent his days polishing an antique piano. They thought B and I had nothing but this $1.2 million house and a modest government pension. They truly believed they could push me into a dark basement, wait for me to die, and then collect the scraps of my mediocre life. I looked directly at Chloe. Her pale blue eyes were wide with terror, but I could see a tiny, pathetic glimmer of hope still lingering in her expression. She still believed she was the primary beneficiary of a $5.5 million offshore account. I decided it was time to extinguish that hope permanently. I told Chloe that she was a complete and utter fool. I explained that the highly confidential letter from the Geneva wealth management firm, the letter that promised them millions of dollars upon my natural death, was absolutely nothing but a piece of cheap printer paper. I told her I drafted that document myself, sitting on the cheap folding cot in the damp basement they locked me in. I printed it on my own machine upstairs and slipped it under her fashion magazine just to see how far her incredible greed would take her. I watched the color completely drain from her face. Her legs gave out for a second, and she had to grip the edge of the catering table to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The $5.5 million did not exist. The offshore trust was a ghost. The entire motivation behind her dark web purchase and her plan to induce a fatal heart attack was based on a trap I built out of thin air. She gasped for air, looking like a drowning woman who just realized the life raft was a painted illusion. But my poverty was also an illusion. I added my voice echoing in the grand living room. I told them the Swiss trust was bait, but my real wealth was not a fantasy. I reached into the manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of notarized property deeds, holding them up under the bright chandelier light. I told them that B and I did not just buy this house in Buckhead. I told them that back in the 1990s, while I was working double shifts and saving every single penny, we started quietly buying up commercial real estate. We bought neglected brick buildings and empty lots in areas that the wealthy elite completely overlooked. I held up the official deeds bearing the golden seal of the state of Georgia. I told them that I was the sole proprietor of a massive commercial holding company. I told them I owned the entire Midtown complex. The name of the commercial center hung in the air like a heavy steel blade waiting to drop. Chloe stopped breathing. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the white tablecloth so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. The Midtown complex was the premier shopping district in the city. It was also the exact location of her high-end luxury fashion boutique. It was the expensive retail space she rented the store she desperately tried to save by selling my wife piano and stealing my credit cards. She stared at the property deeds in my hand, her mind finally connecting the devastating dots. She had spent the last 2 years complaining to Kendrick about her ruthless, invisible landlord who refused to lower her monthly rent. She had cursed the holding company that demanded strict on-time payments while her business slowly bled cash. She never once realized that the invisible landlord she hated was the very same man she was trying to lock in a state asylum. I stepped closer to her, ignoring Kendrick entirely. I looked deep into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. I told her that she thought she was stealing from a weak, vulnerable old man. I told her she never realized that she was actually plotting to murder the man who owned the very ground she stood on. I let the absolute horror of that statement sink into her core. Then I delivered the final crushing blow. I told her that because she was 3 months behind on her commercial lease, and because I owned the building outright, I had personally visited my legal team this morning. I told her I filed the emergency commercial eviction papers for her bankrupt little shop at exactly 9 o'clock today. I said by the time the sun rises tomorrow morning, the county sheriff will have padlocked her glass doors and seized every single piece of stolen designer clothing she had inside. She was completely and utterly ruined. Kendrick watched his wife crumble under the weight of her own greed. He looked at the property deeds in my hand and finally understood that every single move they made was anticipated and countered with absolute precision. He dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor right in front of the catering table. The expensive tailored shirt he wore was completely soaked with nervous sweat. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. He was no longer the arrogant tech entrepreneur who thought he could lock his own father in a damp basement and steal a lifetime of hard work. He was a terrified boy begging for his life. He reached out, trying to grab the edge of my charcoal wool suit, but I took a deliberate step backward. I would not let him touch me. He pleaded with me, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of his imminent destruction. He said, "Dad, please, you have to help me." He said the men from the cryptocurrency loan syndicate would kill him if he did not hand over the $200,000 by midnight tonight. He sobbed uncontrollably, telling me that these men knew exactly where he lived, and they had explicitly threatened to break his legs and burn the entire house down to the ground. He begged me to just let him keep the money from the home equity line of credit just this one time to save his life. He promised he would pay me back every single penny. He promised he would walk away and never bother me again if I just let him have the cash. I looked down at the pathetic man kneeling on my floor. I thought about the decades of 80-hour work weeks I endured to put him through elite private schools and a prestigious university. I thought about the countless times my late wife B and I sacrificed our own comfort so he could have every possible advantage in a world that was designed to hold him back. And then I thought about the audio recording I captured in the dark. The recording of him agreeing to drug me into submission and throw me into an abusive, underfunded state asylum to die alone. I smiled down at him, but it was a cold, empty expression that held absolutely no warmth or paternal affection. I asked him if he meant the $200,000 he obtained by deliberately forging my signature on a federal bank document. I watched his eyes widen in pure raw shock as I laid out the exact details of his financial crime in front of the remaining guests. I told him he thought he was so incredibly clever using an obscure online lending agency and a fake notary stamp provided by his arrogant wife. I explained that I knew about the fraudulent loan application the exact minute he clicked submit on his computer. I told him I personally called the executive fraud division of my primary bank and specifically instructed them to let the wire transfer process. I told him the bank flagged the transaction the moment the stolen money hit his joint checking account. I leaned in close, resting my weight on my ebony walking cane so he could hear every single word clearly over the sound of his own pathetic sobbing. I told him that the money he thought would save his life was a complete mirage. I said the funds were frozen 48 hours ago by federal investigators who were actively building a wire fraud case against him. He never had a single dime to pay off his violent creditors. He was completely broke and entirely defenseless. Kendrick stopped breathing. The devastating reality of his situation crashed down on him with crushing physical force. He had no money to pay the loan sharks. He had no house to sell. He had no future left to build. He was a dead man walking, and he knew it. Before he could even formulate a response to the terrifying truth, the atmosphere in the grand living room abruptly changed. The heavy silk curtains covering the large front bay windows were suddenly illuminated by blinding flashes of light. Rapid alternating strokes of bright red and piercing blue light cut through the elegant living room, washing over the terrified faces of the remaining wealthy guests. The flashing colors painted the walls in a frantic, chaotic rhythm. The loud, aggressive sound of heavy tires crushing the gravel in my long driveway echoed loudly through the thick walls of the estate. 4 marked police cruisers and 2 large, unmarked black sport utility vehicles belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation pulled up directly onto the front lawn. The heavy slam of car doors shutting in unison sounded like the final nails being driven into a wooden coffin. The authorities had arrived exactly on time, just as I had planned. Complete panic overtook my son. The primal instinct of a cornered animal completely consumed his rational mind. Kendrick scrambled off the floor, slipping heavily on the spilled champagne and the polished hardwood. He did not look at his wife Chloe, who was still paralyzed by her own financial ruin, leaning heavily against the catering table. He did not look at me to beg for mercy one last time. He turned around and sprinted toward the back of the house with reckless desperation. He thought he could run through the gourmet kitchen, push open the heavy glass patio doors, and disappear into the dense dark woods behind the Buckhead estate. He thought he could escape the federal authorities the exact same way he tried to escape his financial responsibilities and his moral obligations. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, knocking over a tall floral arrangement in his blind panic. I did not chase him. I did not raise my voice to tell him to stop. I did not even turn my head to watch him run away. I simply stood by the catering table, leaning calmly on my brass-handled cane. I knew exactly what was waiting for him in the backyard. When I called my old friend, retired Judge Marcus Caldwell, to set up the final trap, I made sure every single detail was perfectly covered. The judge had personally contacted the federal task force commander earlier that evening to brief him on the layout of my property. They knew Kendrick was a massive flight risk. They knew he was desperate and cornered. As my son reached the gourmet kitchen and violently shoved the heavy glass patio doors open, he was instantly met by the blinding glare of high-powered tactical flashlights piercing through the darkness. 6 heavily armed federal agents were already stationed at the perimeter of the property, blocking every possible escape route. They had surrounded the entire estate before the police cruisers even turned on their sirens. The trap was completely sealed, and there was absolutely no way out for the boy who tried to bury his own father alive. The heavy custom oak front doors of my Buckhead estate swung open with a massive violent thud that shook the entryway. Uniformed local police officers and heavily armed federal agents poured into the grand foyer like a tidal wave of absolute justice. Their heavy tactical boots trampled over the expensive Persian rugs and crushed the shattered crystal of the champagne flutes that lay scattered across the hardwood floor. The flashing red and blue lights from the emergency cruisers parked on the front lawn cast long, terrifying shadows across the elegant living room walls. The remaining wealthy guests backed away, pressing themselves against the expensive wallpaper, completely terrified by the sudden, chaotic invasion of law enforcement. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man wearing a dark tactical vest, stepped into the center of the room. He held a thick leather folder packed with federal arrest warrants. His sharp eyes scanned the room quickly, assessing the panicked crowd, before locking onto the 2 people standing near the center of the destruction. Chloe was still standing near the catered buffet table. The emerald green designer dress she wore suddenly looked like a cheap, discarded costume. The pristine, flawless illusion of her high society life was completely and utterly shattered. When the lead federal agent called out her name and the name of my son in a loud, commanding voice, something inside her snapped. The survival instinct of a true, ruthless predator kicked into overdrive. She did not stand by her husband. She did not maintain her dignified, arrogant posture. She threw her hands up in the air, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at the hallway where Kendrick had just tried to escape. She began to scream at the top of her lungs. Her voice was shrill and desperate, echoing painfully off the high, vaulted ceilings of the living room. She yelled that it was all his idea. She told the federal agents that Kendrick forced her to do everything against her will. She sobbed frantically, claiming she was just a terrified, obedient wife trying to survive a controlling husband. She did not hesitate for a single second to expose his massive cryptocurrency failures to the entire room of wealthy investors. She screamed that he owed $150,000 to violent underground loan sharks and that he was willing to commit any crime necessary to get that money. She painted herself as an innocent, helpless victim caught in the dangerous crossfire of his reckless gambling debts. She begged the officers not to arrest her, swearing that she was manipulated into silence. Her pathetic theatrical performance was abruptly interrupted by the loud sound of scuffling coming from the gourmet kitchen. Two massive federal agents marched back into the living room, forcibly dragging my son between them. Kendrick was completely out of breath. His expensive tailored dress shirt was torn at the shoulder and covered in dark dirt from the backyard patio where they had tackled him to the ground. He looked absolutely pathetic, a broken, defeated man who thought he could outrun a federal dragnet. When Kendrick heard his wife throwing him to the wolves, his own dark survival instinct flared up. He did not try to protect the woman he married. He fought against the iron grip of the federal agents, twisting his body and yelling back at Chloe with pure, unadulterated venom. He told the police not to listen to a single word that came out of her mouth. He screamed that she was the absolute mastermind behind the darkest parts of their conspiracy. He made sure every single federal agent and every remaining guest heard him say that Chloe was the one who went on the dark web to buy the black market potassium poison. He yelled that she was actively planning to induce a fatal heart attack to murder his father in cold blood. The wealthy guests gasped in renewed horror as the husband and wife publicly tore each other to pieces right in front of them. But Kendrick did not stop there. The dam had broken, and all the toxic secrets poured out into the open. He yelled that Chloe was the one who stole my identity while I was lying in a hospital bed. He confessed loudly that she opened 3 platinum credit cards in my name just to save her bankrupt luxury fashion boutique. He laid bare every single one of her financial crimes, ensuring that if he was going to rot in a federal prison, she was going to be locked in a concrete cell right next to him. They screamed over each other, exposing years of deceit, fraud, and incredible malice. I stood quietly by the catering table, leaning heavily on my polished brass walking cane, watching their marriage disintegrate in real time. For years, they had operated as a unified front of arrogance and greed. They had looked down on me, thinking their combined intellect could easily outsmart a 75-year-old man with a replaced hip. They thought my silence meant I was weak and oblivious. Now they were reduced to nothing but 2 desperate criminals turning on each other to save their own miserable skin. The lead federal agent did not look amused by their screaming match. He had heard enough. He signaled to his tactical team, and 4 officers stepped forward, pulling out their heavy metal handcuffs. They grabbed Chloe by the arms, ignoring her dramatic wailing, and spun her around to secure her wrists. She kicked and thrashed, crying out that her boutique would be ruined, but the officers locked her down with ruthless efficiency. The lead agent walked past the screaming couple and approached me. He stopped a few feet away and gave a small, respectful nod, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. He asked me in a calm, professional voice if my name was Julius Reed. I stood perfectly straight, adjusting the lapel of my charcoal wool suit. I did not look like a victim. I looked like the undisputed master of my own estate. I looked the agent directly in the eyes and confirmed my identity in a steady, unwavering voice. The agent glanced down at the thick manila envelope of commercial property deeds resting on the table next to me, the ultimate proof of my hidden empire. He then gestured toward the 2 sweating, terrified people being held securely by his officers. He asked me to formally confirm the identities of the suspects listed on the federal arrest warrants. I turned my head slowly. I took my time, letting the weight of the moment press down on everyone in the room. I looked at Chloe first. The arrogant woman who had locked me in a damp basement and laughed about selling my late wife piano to a shady dealer was now weeping uncontrollably. Her expensive makeup was smeared across her face. Her perfect high society facade was completely and permanently ruined. She could not even look me in the eye. Then I shifted my cold gaze to Kendrick. The boy I had raised with my own two hands. The boy I had protected from the harsh realities of this world, working 80-hour weeks so he would never know the pain of an empty stomach or an unpaid bill. He was breathing heavily, staring at me with eyes full of absolute soul-crushing terror. He realized that this was the very end of the line. There were no more lies he could tell to talk his way out of this. There were no more fake doctors he could bribe to declare me incompetent. The federal agents were securing his arms behind his back, preparing to march him out the front door. In a final act of utter desperation, Kendrick stopped fighting the officers. He stopped screaming at his wife. He looked at me, and genuine hot tears began to stream down his face. They were not tears of remorse for what he had done to me. They were not tears of guilt for plotting to end my life. They were tears of pure selfish fear because he finally understood the terrifying reality of spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. His voice broke into a pathetic whisper as he begged me for mercy. He called me Dad. He told me that he was my son. He pleaded with me to tell the federal agents that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. He begged me to drop the charges, to tell them I authorized the $200,000 loan, to say that the dark web poison was just a terrible joke. He begged me to save him one last time, using the bond of our blood as his final shield. The entire living room went completely silent. The wealthy guests, the federal agents, and the local police officers all waited to see what I would do. They waited to see if the unconditional love of a father would override the cold, unforgiving logic of justice. They watched the 75-year-old man leaning on his cane, wondering if my heart would break for the crying boy in the torn shirt. I looked down at the empty space on the Persian rug, the exact spot where the vintage Steinway & Sons piano used to sit for over 30 years. The space where my beautiful Bee used to play jazz music on quiet Sunday mornings, filling this house with warmth and soul. Then I looked back up at the man who had sold her memory to save his own pathetic life. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger, sadness, or regret. My face was a mask of absolute unyielding stone. I told him that he sold Bee piano. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him I have no son. The finality of my words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Kendrick let out a broken, agonizing sob that echoed through the grand room, but I had already turned my back on him. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs closing tightly around his wrists rang out clearly through the silent house. It was the exact sound of the silent guillotine finally dropping, cutting him out of my life forever. The heavy front doors of my Buckhead estate closed with a quiet, firm click. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers and local police cars slowly faded down the long gravel driveway, disappearing into the warm Georgia night. The chaotic symphony of shouting officers, crying suspects, and horrified wealthy guests was completely gone. In its place, a profound, heavy silence washed over the massive house. The catering staff, who had been hiding in the kitchen during the entire federal raid, quietly packed up their silver platters and expensive leftover appetizers. They did not ask for their final payment. They did not make eye contact with me. They simply carried their crates out the side door, moving like frightened ghosts, desperate to escape a haunted house. I stood completely alone in the center of the grand living room. The shattered pieces of crystal from Chloe dropping her champagne glass still littered the polished hardwood floor. A few hours ago, this room was packed with the arrogant elite of Atlanta, sipping stolen wine and celebrating a fake fashion empire. Now it was entirely empty. I leaned my weight onto my brass-handled ebony cane and took a deep, slow breath. I looked around the silent room, waiting for the crushing wave of paternal grief to hit me. I waited for the tears to fall for the son I had just sent to a federal penitentiary. I waited for the devastating heartbreak that is supposed to come when a father realizes his only child is gone forever. But the tears never came. The heartbreak never arrived. Instead, as I stood there in my tailored charcoal wool suit, I felt an overwhelming, absolute sense of peace. It was the deep, clean serenity of a man who has just excised a fatal tumor from his own body. Kendrick and Chloe were a poison. They were a slow-moving rot that had infested the sanctuary I built for my late wife, Bee. They had tried to break my mind, steal my legacy, and bury me in a dark, damp basement. By removing them, I had not lost a family. I had saved my own life. I walked slowly through the empty hallways, turning off the bright chandelier lights one by one. I did not go down to the basement. I did not step foot into the master bedroom where Chloe had set up her stolen inventory. I walked into the small guest room on the first floor, laid down on the simple bed, and slept a deep, dreamless sleep for the first time in months. When the sun rose the next morning, the real work began. I did not shed a single tear for the 2 criminals sitting in federal holding cells downtown. I picked up my phone and called the premier commercial cleaning and restoration crew in Atlanta. I had used their services for decades whenever I bought neglected commercial properties that needed to be completely gutted and sanitized. I told the operations manager I needed his absolute best team at my house immediately, and price was not an object. Within an hour, a fleet of white vans pulled up to my estate. A team of 20 professional cleaners wearing pristine uniforms marched into the house. I stood in the foyer and gave them very specific, ruthless instructions. I told them to go into the master bedroom and bag up every single piece of designer clothing, every pair of expensive shoes, and every drop of cheap perfume belonging to my former daughter-in-law. I told them to clear out Kendrick home office, throwing his monitors, his fake business files, and his ridiculous cryptocurrency ledgers directly into heavy-duty black trash bags. I sat on the patio drinking a cup of strong black coffee, watching as the cleaners systematically erased every physical trace of my son and his wife from the property. They hauled dozens of heavy black bags out to a commercial dumpster parked in the driveway. I instructed the lead cleaner to scrub the hardwood floors, to steam the Persian rugs, and to open every single window in the house to let the fresh Georgia air completely flush out the toxic, lingering scent of Chloe floral perfume. By mid-afternoon, the house was immaculate. The master bedroom was completely restored to its original state. B elegant cherry wood vanity desk was moved back to its rightful place by the bay window. The basement door was left wide open, the damp air replaced by the warm sunlight pouring down the stairs. The house felt like it could finally breathe again. The rot was gone, but the sanctuary was not yet complete. I walked back into the living room and stared at the empty space on the Persian rug. The deep indentations in the fabric where the vintage Steinway & Sons piano used to sit were still there. The house was clean, but the soul of my wife was still missing. I picked up my phone and called a private investigator. He was a former Atlanta homicide detective who now handled highly sensitive corporate espionage cases for my commercial real estate firm. He arrived at my house less than an hour later, sitting across from me at the formal dining room table. He placed a leather notepad in front of him, ready to take down the details of my next target. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my personal checkbook. I signed my name at the bottom of a blank check and slid it across the polished oak table. The investigator looked at the blank check and then looked up at me with a questioning gaze. I did not blink. I told him to listen to me very carefully. I told him that my former daughter-in-law sold a vintage Steinway piano to a shady underground antique dealer in East Atlanta a few weeks ago. I gave him the exact serial number I had memorized decades ago and the original appraisal documents. I leaned forward, folding my hands over the top of my cane. I told him to track down that dealer and find out exactly who bought the piano. I told him I did not care if he had to bribe someone to get the information. I told him I did not care who the current owner was or where they lived. I tapped my finger against the blank check sitting on the table. I told him to find the Steinway and buy it back. I said I did not care how much it cost. I told him to bring my wife's soul back to this house. The investigator nodded slowly, recognizing the absolute unyielding determination in my voice. He folded the blank check, placed it into his leather jacket, and walked out the front door without asking another question. For the next 3 days, I lived in complete silence. I tended to the garden B had planted in the backyard, trimming the rose bushes and watering the hydrangeas. I ignored the frantic phone calls from Kendrick defense attorney begging me to drop the federal charges. I ignored the dramatic voicemail messages from Chloe parents demanding to know why their precious daughter was facing 15 years in a federal penitentiary. I blocked their numbers and focused entirely on rebuilding my peace. On the 4th morning, my phone rang with a secure, encrypted number. It was my private investigator. I answered the call immediately, asking if he had located the piano. His voice was tight, frustrated, and completely devoid of his usual confident tone. He told me he found the shady dealer in East Atlanta within a few hours. He said the dealer was terrified of facing stolen property charges and immediately handed over the sales ledger. But the news was not good. The investigator explained that the piano was not sitting in a dusty warehouse waiting to be bought. It had been sold at a private underground auction 3 days after Chloe fenced it. The buyer was a highly prominent, incredibly arrogant venture capitalist who lived in an ultra-exclusive compound in Alpharetta. The investigator said he drove out to the compound and offered the buyer double the market value of the Steinway using my blank check. He offered him $130,000 in pure cash to simply hand the piano back over to its rightful owner. I gripped my phone tightly, asking why the piano was not already on a delivery truck. The investigator sighed heavily. He told me the venture capitalist flatly refused the blank check. He said the arrogant billionaire laughed in his face, claiming he did not need the money. The buyer told the investigator that the vintage Steinway was a rare acoustic masterpiece, and it was now the permanent centerpiece of his grand architectural foyer. He said it made him look cultured in front of his wealthy guests, and he absolutely refused to sell it back at any price. I felt a cold, dangerous fire ignite in my chest. A billionaire thought he could hold my wife's memory hostage simply because he liked how it looked in his hallway. He thought his massive bank account made him completely untouchable. He thought a blank check was a sign of desperation, and he assumed I had no other leverage to use against him. I asked the investigator for the exact name of the arrogant buyer. When he read the name over the phone, a slow, dark smile spread across my face. I knew exactly who this man was. I knew his business portfolio. I knew his corporate ambitions. And most importantly, I knew the exact commercial real estate development project he had been desperately trying to get approved by the city zoning commission for the last 2 years. He thought he was dealing with a grieving widow begging for a piece of furniture. He did not realize he was dealing with the largest commercial landlord in the Midtown district. I told the investigator to come back to the house and tear up the blank check. I told him money was no longer the weapon of choice. This arrogant fool thought he could keep B piano as a shiny trophy. I was going to have to play one last game of ruthless corporate hardball to teach him that nobody in this city is untouchable. I did not send a lawyer or an emissary to handle this final transaction. I put on my tailored charcoal wool suit, gripped my brass-handled ebony cane, and ordered my private driver to take me directly to the ultra-exclusive gated compound in Alpharetta. The drive took 45 minutes. I spent the entire time looking out the tinted window, calculating the exact, precise angle of my attack. The man I was going to see was a billionaire venture capitalist named Richard Sterling. He was a man who made his fortune by stepping on the throats of smaller businesses. He thought money was an absolute shield against consequence. I arrived at the massive iron gates of his estate, and my driver announced my name. Sterling had agreed to 5 minutes of his time out of sheer morbid curiosity, expecting to see a desperate old widower begging for a family heirloom. He had no idea who was actually walking up his marble driveway. A butler led me through the towering double doors and into a grand architectural foyer that looked more like a sterile museum than a home. The floors were imported white marble, the ceilings soared 3 stories high, and there, sitting right in the center of that soulless, echoing room, was the vintage Steinway & Sons grand piano that belonged to my wife. My breath caught in my chest for a fraction of a second. Seeing the deep, rich mahogany wood sitting under the harsh, modern gallery lighting felt like a physical violation. It was completely out of place. It belonged in a warm living room filled with the scent of lemon oil and the sound of jazz. Sterling walked down the sweeping glass staircase wearing a casual cashmere sweater and an arrogant smirk. He did not offer his hand. He simply crossed his arms and looked at me with a profound sense of superiority. I told him I was Julius Reed, the original owner of the piano he had purchased from a black market dealer. I told him I was prepared to reimburse his entire purchase price and add a significant premium for his trouble. He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that echoed off the marble walls. He told me that he did not care about a premium. He said he bought the piano fair and square at a private auction. He walked over and ran his hand disrespectfully across the polished wood. He told me the instrument was a centerpiece now. He said it gave his foyer the perfect aesthetic touch, and he had absolutely no intention of selling it back to a sentimental old man. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg. I did not threaten him with legal action over receiving stolen property, because a man with his resources could easily tie the case up in civil court for years. I simply planted my cane firmly on the marble floor and looked at him with cold, absolute authority. I told him that I was not a sentimental old man. I told him I was the founding partner of the Reed Commercial Real Estate Holding Company. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered for a brief second, but he tried to maintain his composure. I continued speaking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I told him I knew exactly why he was feeling so confident lately. I told him I knew about his massive commercial development project on the west side of the city. I laid out the exact details of his $50 million investment that was currently entirely stalled because he desperately needed a specialized commercial zoning permit to break ground. I told him that his investors were breathing down his neck, and if he did not secure that permit by the end of the month, his entire project would collapse into bankruptcy. Sterling stopped leaning against the piano. His posture became rigid. I took one step closer to him. I told him that the specialized zoning permit he needed had to be approved by a highly selective urban development committee. And then I delivered the killing blow. I told him that the chairman of that exact zoning committee was a retired state judge named Marcus Caldwell. I watched the blood completely drain from the face of Richard Sterling. He knew exactly who Judge Caldwell was. Every developer in Atlanta knew the judge was an absolute gatekeeper for major commercial projects. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked him dead in the eyes and told him that Marcus Caldwell was my oldest and closest friend. I told him that Marcus and I grew up together on the same street and that we spoke every single day. I told him that if I made one single phone call right now from his immaculate marble foyer, that zoning permit would be permanently denied and his $50 million project would turn to dust before the sun set. I did not make a threat. I simply laid out the absolute undeniable facts of my leverage. I told him he had a very simple choice to make. He could keep a piece of wooden furniture to impress his shallow friends, or he could save his multi-million-dollar corporate development. The silence in the grand foyer was deafening. The arrogant billionaire venture capitalist suddenly looked incredibly small. His breathing became shallow. He looked at the Steinway and then he looked back at me, realizing with absolute terror that he had unknowingly crossed a man who held the keys to his entire financial future. He swallowed hard, his arrogance entirely evaporated. He told me in a quiet, defeated voice that I could have the piano. He said he would arrange for his private movers to deliver it back to my estate immediately without charging me a single dime. I turned my back on him without saying another word. I walked out the towering double doors and got back into my vehicle. 3 hours later, a professional moving truck backed into my long gravel driveway in Buckhead. I stood in the living room instructing the movers with precise, specific directions. They carried the heavy grand piano through the front doors and carefully lowered it onto the antique Persian rug. I made sure they aligned the wooden legs exactly with the 4 deep circular indentations that had been burned into the fabric over 3 decades. When the movers left, I locked the front door. The house was completely silent. The sanctuary was finally whole again. I walked over to the piano. I ran my hand over the rich mahogany wood, feeling the familiar warmth of the memory of my wife returning to the house. I sat down on the leather bench. B used to sit here for hours, playing melodies that filled my heart with absolute peace. I reached out and gently lifted the heavy wooden lid to inspect the strings. As the lid rose, I noticed something wedged tightly near the back hinge. It was a small, hidden compartment that B used to use to hide her spare sheet music and tuning tools. I reached my hand inside the narrow gap. My fingers brushed against a thick, folded piece of aged parchment paper. I pulled it out into the light. It was a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in the beautiful, sweeping handwriting of my wife. B had left a note hidden inside the piano years ago, a message waiting in the dark for me to find it. I stood in the center of the living room holding the sealed envelope in my hands. The heavy parchment paper was slightly yellowed from age, but my name written in the beautiful sweeping cursive of my late wife B was as clear as the day she wrote it. My fingers trembled just a fraction of an inch. For weeks I had operated with the cold, calculated precision of a machine, dismantling the lives of my son and his wife without a single ounce of hesitation. But holding this letter, feeling the physical weight of my wife reaching out to me from the past, completely broke through my armor. I did not open it immediately. I knew that whatever she wrote in that letter was meant for the absolute end of the journey. I walked over to the mahogany side table and placed the envelope safely inside the top drawer. I needed to finish the war before I could finally rest. 6 months passed. The federal justice system moves with a slow, crushing inevitability when the evidence is absolutely flawless. I did not attend the sentencing hearing. I did not want to sit in a sterile wooden courtroom and look at the faces of the 2 people who tried to bury me alive. I stayed in the comfort of my own home, sitting in my leather recliner looking out the bay window into the bright Georgia morning. My lawyer called me precisely at noon to deliver the final verdict. The federal judge did not show a single ounce of mercy. Kendrick was sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He was found guilty on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, financial tampering, and elder abuse. His desperate tears in the courtroom did not save him. The crypto loan sharks he owed money to were also swept up in the federal investigation, completely dismantling his entire criminal network. He lost everything. He lost his freedom, his dignity, and his family. Chloe received a much harsher fate. The federal prosecutors played the crystal-clear audio recording of her detailing the purchase of the dark web poison directly to the jury. They proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that she had meticulously planned to induce a fatal heart attack to murder me in my sleep. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder and severe identity theft. Her failing high-end boutique was completely liquidated. Her arrogant, wealthy friends entirely abandoned her. She was stripped of her designer clothes and forced into a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The luxurious life she thought she was entitled to was permanently erased. The silent guillotine had dropped and severed them from society completely. When the lawyer finished reading the sentencing report, I simply thanked him and hung up the phone. I did not feel a rush of triumphant joy. I did not celebrate their downfall. I felt the profound, heavy silence of absolute closure. The debt was paid in full. The empire I built was completely secure. I walked into the kitchen and opened the top drawer of the mahogany table. I took out the aged envelope B had left hidden inside the vintage Steinway piano. I carried it over to the living room and sat down on the leather bench directly in front of the ivory keys. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large windows, casting a warm golden glow across the rich wood of the instrument. I carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the heavy paper. My dearest Julius, the letter began. If you are reading this note, it means I am no longer with you and you have found my secret hiding place. I am writing this to you because I know the kind of man you are. You are a builder, a protector, and a warrior. You spent your entire life shielding our son Kendrick from the harsh realities of the world. You gave him everything we never had growing up in the South. But I have watched him closely these past few years, and my heart aches with a heavy realization. I fear that our endless generosity has completely spoiled his spirit. He looks at our hard work and sees only a bank account. He looks at our sacrifices and feels entitled to the reward. I paused, taking a deep, slow breath. Even years ago, B had seen the dark seeds of greed taking root in our son. She possessed a quiet, brilliant wisdom that I had been too blinded by a fatherly love to fully accept. I closed my eyes for a moment, seeing her gentle face in my memory before I continued reading her beautiful cursive words. Julius, I need you to make me a promise. If the day ever comes when the people we love try to take advantage of your kind heart, I need you to remember who you truly are. You are Julius Reed. You climbed out of poverty through sheer iron will. Our strength is not in our bloodline, but in our profound self-respect. Never let anyone diminish the empire we built together. Never let anyone make you feel small in your own castle. Protect your peace, my love, and never apologize for defending your dignity. I will be waiting for you on the other side. Play a song for me when you miss me. With all my eternal love, B. A single warm tear escaped my eye and rolled slowly down my cheek. It was the very first tear I had shed since this entire nightmare began. It was not a tear of sorrow or grief. It was a tear of absolute profound gratitude. My wife had reached across the barrier of time to validate the hardest decision I ever had to make. She knew I would have to cut the rot out of my life to survive, and she gave me her absolute blessing to do it. She knew the boy we raised had lost his way, and she wanted me to know that letting him face his own consequences was not a failure of fatherhood, but a triumph of self-respect. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the inside breast pocket of my suit right next to my heart. I stood up and walked over to the vintage crystal decanter resting on the sidebar. I poured myself a generous measure of the most expensive, neat bourbon I owned. I raised the heavy crystal glass to the ceiling, offering a silent toast to the brilliant, beautiful woman who had been my true partner in this life. The burn of the bourbon was smooth and grounding, spreading a deep warmth through my chest. I walked back to the Steinway piano and sat down on the leather bench. The house was completely quiet. There were no caterers trampling the floors. There were no arrogant socialites drinking stolen champagne. There were no greedy relatives plotting my demise in the rooms above me. The sanctuary was entirely mine again. I thought about the sheer audacity of my son and his wife believing they could lock a man like me in a damp basement and simply wait for me to expire. They truly believed my age made me obsolete. They learned the hard way that wisdom, patience, and a lifetime of strategic thinking will always outsmart blind, arrogant greed. I reached out and placed my hands gently over the black and white keys. I had not played the piano in many years. My fingers were slightly stiff, but the muscle memory of a lifetime of love guided my hands. I pressed down on the keys, playing the first few soulful chords of Georgia on my mind. The rich, resonant acoustic sound filled the massive living room, echoing beautifully off the vaulted ceilings. The music flowed through the empty hallways, washing away the last lingering shadows of betrayal and deceit. I looked at a framed silver photograph of Bea resting on the mantel across the room. She was smiling, her eyes full of light and unwavering strength. I played the melody for her, letting the music speak the words I no longer needed to say out loud. I did not just survive the brutal trap my family set for me. I conquered it with absolute ruthless precision. I protected the legacy we built with our own bare hands, and I ensured that our names would never be associated with weakness. The sun slowly dipped below the tree line, casting long, peaceful shadows across the Persian rug. The battle was officially over. The war was won. I am Julius Reed. I am 75 years old. And as I sat in the golden twilight of my $1.2 million estate, I knew with absolute certainty that I remained the undisputed king of my own castle. The silent guillotine had fallen, and my peace would never be disturbed again. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that sharing blood with someone does not automatically make them family. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and genuine love, not entitlement and greed. We spend our lives sacrificing for our children, hoping to give them a softer world, but sometimes that very softness breeds monsters. You must never let your age or your unconditional love become a weapon used against you. Protecting your peace and defending your dignity is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. Wealth is not measured by the numbers in a bank account, but by the strength you possess to walk away from toxic people, even if you raised them. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and let me know in the comments how you would have handled this ultimate betrayal.